We also want to thank our title sponsors, Capital One.
All right, got to get the tree fired up. It's only going to be around a few more days. MarkRogersTV, the voice of college football. Not quite as easy as it was for Clemson, and not quite as easy as it appeared to be in the first half. And it was for the Alabama Crimson Tide in scoring the first 28 points of the game to go up 28-0. And I certainly have to admit that at that point, I thought, okay, what is this score going to be? Is this going to be one of those like 63-14 games? But Oklahoma fought back, and not that it had the conclusion or was nearly as close as this, or certainly for Alabama, did it turn out in a football sense this tragic. But it had shades of Deshaun Watson in the 2016 championship game, in which Alabama physically dominated, completely just beat up. It almost hurt to watch Oklahoma players, especially on defense, take the body blows from the offensive linemen, from the running backs, and even the wide receivers, especially in the first half. You could almost see the physical dominance of the Alabama football team on offense especially, but also on defense. But I'm thinking about those running backs, and this is what I envisioned when I took a number of phone calls over the past few days about what Alabama would do to Oklahoma, just pound and pound and pound. And when you talk about football players at this level, even in the Big 12, even in Oklahoma, even though we like to make fun of the flag football variety of football that we see in the Big 12, these football players at Oklahoma are imposing. They're dominant. They bench press. They squat tons of weight that most of us cannot relate to. But compare the size and strength of some of those players to the Alabama roster, and then to see it play out from play to play to play, and to see the likes of Damian Harris and Josh Jacobs like a battering ram, just hit after hit after hit, and see the Alabama defensive front have its way in the first half against the Oklahoma offensive line. Then what seemed to happen was that Oklahoma calmed down. Kyler Murray calmed down. They started to get into a rhythm offensively. And when they got into a rhythm offensively, they were able to gas the Alabama defense. And that was reminiscent of what happened to a large part in 2015, but especially in 2016, when Alabama went up 14-0 against Clemson and was just physically imposing, dominant, just beating up a much better Clemson defense than this Oklahoma defense. But Deshaun Watson stayed with it, kept getting up, wasn't playing his best, didn't have enough time, didn't have enough space like Kyler Murray tonight, but he stayed with it and started to make plays, much like Kyler Murray did tonight. Again, the outcome is what matters, and the outcome much different than 2 years ago in that championship game against Clemson, in which Deshaun Watson was able to overcome, and because Clemson's defense was much more formidable, allow him to come back and get the victory 35-31, as opposed to this Alabama team and its matchup with Oklahoma, in which the Sooners just not physically dominant enough to stand toe-to-toe with Alabama. And it basically took an extra human effort from Kyler Murray, despite all of his mistakes and hiccups in the first quarter and through much of the second quarter, in which he just didn't look himself, and he was being somewhat intimidated. It appeared, I hate to put that label on anybody, that you were intimidated, because I don't know how you felt. I don't know how Kyler Murray felt. He looked a bit overwhelmed and intimidated, which is understandable because, as we all knew, he had not faced a defense this good. He had faced Texas twice. He had faced TCU and Iowa State. Those would be the best defenses that Kyler Murray has faced. He had faced defenses that were in the top 30 to 40 to 45 in the country. And that's a large gap between that standard and facing probably the best defense in the country, definitely one of the top 3 or 4. But he hung with it, and he amassed some big offensive totals. But the winner, and still reigning champion, the Alabama Crimson Tide, wins it. What was it? 45-34. I was looking at this score thinking, okay, I have a chance to be right on the money, but darn, those Oklahoma Sooners, they had to score that final touchdown to make it 45-34. I said 45-27, and then I thought about my conversation with Reasonable Gump, who said, I'm going to notch it up a touchdown. Well, we split the difference. Not 52-34 like Reasonable said, and not 45-27 like yours truly stated and predicted, but somewhere in the middle at 45-34. And I had my saddest moment of the day when Alabama took a knee at the 6-yard line. Tide wins at 45-34. That's what's important. That's what matters. And now we have, for a 4th consecutive year, 4 straight years, Alabama and Clemson. I would guess that Alabama, based on its performance tonight and what Clemson showed us against Notre Dame, maybe that spread determined by Vegas will be a little bit tighter than what we anticipated. Just a little bit tighter. I was thinking in the 10-11 range. But then again, Clemson, they were a 12-point pick against Notre Dame. Alabama, 14 against Oklahoma. I would think that this game's going to be somewhere in the 9 to 10-point range. I'm going to check out the live stream and put my call-in number right in there at 860-325-3687. 860-325-3687. And we'll see what you guys have to say. I didn't take a whole lot of notes on this. Once it got to be 28-0, I thought, man, my meticulous notes are meaningless. And then it started to get close, and I started taking more notes. I never had the feeling that Oklahoma really had a chance. They got to within 11 during the 4th quarter there, and they had a chance. They certainly had a chance. And unfortunately for them, on that second onside kick, the Oklahoma player didn't play it correctly and didn't let the ball roll 10 yards. It's Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football. Who's on the line?
Hi, Mark. Reasonable Gump.
Hey, man.
I know most Alabama fans are probably happy just that we won, but I got to say, I'm not really feeling good about how most of that game went. I mean, 28-0, and then they scored on every single drive after that.
Mm-hmm.
Mostly because of our ridiculous unsportsmanlike penalties. And when I say unsportsmanlike, I don't just mean the unsportsmanlike actual penalty. I mean just the undisciplined. I think that's a better word. Undisciplined penalties out there that just kept giving them more opportunities. I mean, yeah, I know we held them to 34 points, which is good, which is great and all, but yeah, I just thought I don't think Saban's happy with that performance, particularly on the defense side.
It didn't seem as though he was that happy after the game, because in recent years, and correct me if I'm wrong, he has seemed to be more of a defender of his team's efforts, where at one point in his career, and certainly in his Alabama tenure, he was demanding the best. And he still does, but I think at one point he started to get sick of the media always expecting a perfect performance, and he started to defend his team a few years ago to basically say, hey, the other team tries to. They have scholarship athletes as well. We're doing our best. We made a few mistakes, but I'm proud of our team. I'm proud of our effort. We can't go out and pitch a 52-0 shutout every day. He started to take on that attitude a few years ago, but this is the first time I've seen him this year basically say, hey, yeah, I'm proud that we executed at times. The offense got off to a great start, but there's a lot of things we need to clean up. He made that comment a couple times.
I mean, I'm just going to take two just off the top. I'm thinking about the top of my head. This may have been on the same drive actually, but when we have them at 4th and 5 inside their own red zone,
yeah,
there's absolutely zero excuse for us letting them somehow get a touchdown out of that. I don't care that they got the 4th down conversion. The point is, we were good enough. We should have been good enough to at least stop them before they got to the end zone. If you got them to 4th down in their own red zone, that one, and then the one where Kyler Murray his knee may or may not have touched the ground, but it didn't matter because our guy freaking took his helmet off immediately after that. For what reason, I cannot even possibly understand why. I have no idea what possessed them to do something like that.
I don't either.
But so it didn't end up mattering. I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
Yeah, I don't know. Sometimes you'll see somebody get really angry because maybe they had a confrontation with somebody and they felt as though a penalty should have been called, like they got slapped across the face mask or the helmet or something like that, and they get very frustrated with the lack of a call and they rip off their helmet. But I didn't see anything in that play other than him running around chasing Kyler Murray that would have caused it. I believe that was Raekwon Davis that he would rip off his helmet. Yeah, I didn't see anything there either that would just.
And then of course the weirdness that happened right before the half, where we're at 3rd and half a foot. We somehow get backed up, and Tua runs it back to get it 4th within half of a foot, and then we get a couple false start, or we get another false start after we had already had like 2. Have settled for a field goal. I mean, so Saban was right that, the only time we got stopped is when we stopped ourselves. And so the truth to that. I did think Oklahoma's number 75. I don't know his name, but he's an O-line man. I thought he got away with a pretty blatant, flagrant offense when he kind of like was like shoving Quentin Williams' head into the dirt. I don't understand how that didn't get called. When I saw the replay, I mean, you can correct me if I'm missing something, but it looked like a fair, high tackle. He didn't charge in with his head right to Kyler Murray. He wrapped him up with his arms and just, launched him to the ground. I didn't really see anything wrong with the tackle. So I don't think number 75 on Oklahoma had any excuse to be doing what he did.
So all the points I look for on a situation like that is, number one, was the hit late or not? I don't believe it was late. I've seen some really nitpicky calls by officials in recent years on both levels of football in not allowing these guys a step and a half. But it was not a late hit, but I've seen that called on some plays that had that type of timing. But so it wasn't late. He didn't drop his head. He actually, the one part of it that I could have seen, but the officials' eyes in real time would have had to been exceptional to catch this. But it seemed as though he did kind of, once he had Murray in his grasp, that he did kind of land. He did kind of vault his weight on him momentarily, and then he rolled right off of him. So he basically did all the right things. He didn't drop the head. He wasn't late. He rolled off of him and didn't collapse on Murray. And yeah, the offensive lineman for Oklahoma came immediately to Murray's defense, which I can respect in terms of his approach and showing that we're not going to get pushed around. But it was basically uncalled for because Q Williams didn't do anything outside of the rules.
Yeah, I didn't think it was a late hit either because, back when I was younger and first learning all this, I would always wonder why when a receiver missed a pass or he cheap bobbled one and then the defender tackles him anyway. And I was always wondering why those things weren't called. And my dad explained it to me. He's like, when you're out there and you're running at someone, you can't stop to think about whether or not they've just caught it or in this case have just thrown it. If you're moving, you got to tackle him because there's a chance Kyler Murray didn't let the ball go and he faked it, right? So yeah, I mean, he was hit a split second after he threw the ball. So yeah, I don't think it was late. Again, I didn't see anything particularly ugly about the tackle. It was a hard tackle. Don't get me wrong, but I mean, that's football, and that's part of being anyone who handles the ball. You have to be able to handle a hard tackle. Quarterbacks shouldn't be, an exception. So there was no penalty called on either side there, but I definitely thought Oklahoma's number 75 got away with one.
For the record,
yeah. Go ahead.
For the record, his name's Drew Samia. He's a senior, so he just played his last game at Oklahoma.
But yeah, and finally, I thought Saban took a leaf out of your book as well as a couple more, because it wasn't 60-40 run pass. We threw it. I think we ran it 44 times. We threw it 27. I mean, he took the air out of the ball completely after we went up 28-0. I mean, and I was, while we were moving it, I still didn't like it. I thought the score could have easily been in the 60s if we would have let to it. If he'd just been more aggressive, I think the margin would have been a lot wider than it ended up being. Like, I don't think this ended up being an 11-point game, and it wouldn't have been had he not taken a knee. We would have easily scored there at the end. It wouldn't have mattered. So, but yeah, I thought he took the air out of the ball way too soon, and I think we didn't end up paying for it because we won, but it got closer than it needed to be. And it could have been even closer than that, particularly in that second onside kick that Oklahoma did. Mm-hmm. If the guy had just not touched it on the 8th yard, I mean, Oklahoma would have easily gotten that. They correctly pointed out that all of our guys were blocking. Not one of them was going for the ball. So Oklahoma completely screwed that up. It could have been it could have been even closer than that. And I think partly to blame, and mostly to blame is the defense and their weird uncharacteristic mental errors throughout this whole game, but being way too safe and conservative on offense after we just opened up a can in the first quarter. I think that was a mistake.
So between Josh Jacobs and Damian Harris, while the Oklahoma defense played better against the run in the second half when they were anticipating that it was going to be a running game and that Alabama was going to kind of not shut things down, but be more conservative. So they were more effective. That makes sense. The Alabama running game pretty much did what I expected it to do. And the running backs are just so physical that it's just difficult for that defense in particular to deal with those guys.
Well, anyway, I guess a win's a win. I thought it was really great to see how well Tua played. He only had 3 incomplete passes, threw for well over 300 yards, even ran for a little bit. And so I think all is looking good for next week. But if anyone wanted an exciting game and not like the previous one, not a snooze fest, well, you got it.
Yeah, Oklahoma did just enough to start the second half to keep us interested. I wasn't on the edge of my seat. I never thought Alabama was threatened, but yeah, Oklahoma did enough offensively to keep it interesting.
I'm sure there's other guys who want to get on here and say, how Alabama's going to win everything easily. Going on to number 18, like that guy earlier in the comment section. As you know, I try to keep things real. So, I'm going to let you go. Hey, everyone, like the video while you're at it, and I'll talk to you later, man.
Thanks, Reasonable. Appreciate it. Good stuff from Reasonable Gump, big Alabama fan, and a very reasonable Alabama fan who tries to keep it in perspective and respects the other fan bases and knows that his team is dominant and it's the best program in college football by a pretty wide margin. Now, they are playing, of course, the program that has emerged as the second best program in the country. I know there are certain fan bases in Norman, Oklahoma, Ohio, Columbus, Ohio, Athens, Georgia, who don't want to hear that. But the way it stands right now, and it could change in a year, but as it stands right now, Clemson is the clear number 2 program in the country to Alabama's number 1. And I still don't have a complete gauge on any type of separation between Alabama and Clemson. I would have told you over the course of the entire season that Alabama was far and away the best team in the country. Then they showed us some chinks in the armor against Georgia, of course, and they showed us some tonight, but not necessarily when they were really pressed. They lowered the boom and laid down the hammer in the first quarter, and it was 28-0. Clemson, wow. Okay, they dominated this game against Notre Dame. The game was pretty evenly matched and competed for the first 20 minutes of game time. So the first 20 out of 60 minutes for the first quarter and the next 5 minutes, almost to a half of the second quarter, Notre Dame played just as well as Clemson. And even throughout the entire first half, Notre Dame probably won more plays than Clemson. But Clemson, as I stated when we talked about it during the watch party, Clemson just has more athletes, better athletes. And I don't care what Brian Kelly said after the game. He has to sound like this. He's not going to trash his team and basically say we're inferior. But he just wanted to make the statement in the face of losing by 27 points that we didn't execute today. We didn't play our best. Clemson is not athletically superior to us. We are just as good as they are. We have just as much speed and athleticism. We just didn't play our game. Credit Clemson. They played their best. We didn't play our best. That's not accurate. Notre Dame's capable of beating Clemson on a particular day, but that day probably comes about once a month. If they played every day, Clemson's going to win this game 29 out of 30 times or something like that. 90-some% of the time, Clemson's going to win the game. And it's mostly going to be a lot closer than this one, but they certainly are capable of winning and doing what they did today on a fairly regular basis, because what Notre Dame does well, Clemson does just as well. And then there's a bunch of things that Clemson does that Notre Dame can't do. They just have superior players on the outside. So Notre Dame has some really good wide receivers, but they're not faster. Despite the issues that Clemson had in the defensive backfield this year, they're still superior athletes. It was more about technique and recognition of routes and blown coverages. Those were the problems with Clemson's backfield this year. It had nothing to do with athleticism or lack thereof. For Notre Dame, they don't have the players on offense. They have really good players that we will see play in the NFL. But with Mack and Boykin and Fink, those guys aren't scaring anybody at this level downfield. They're scaring the Navy cornerbacks. They're scaring the even in at this point, the Virginia Tech cornerbacks and the Syracuse cornerbacks, but they're not scaring Clemson cornerbacks. They didn't even scare USC cornerbacks. They couldn't break away from USC. USC handed Notre Dame the game. So credit Notre Dame with winning all of its games against a formidable schedule. Not a schedule as good as it should have been, because Stanford, USC, Florida State, and Virginia Tech were all down. But they won those games against a good schedule, probably the most balanced schedule in college football. I don't think that can be argued, even though they didn't play the elite teams, and everybody tells me that. But how many of those are out there? They played a tough team, a decent team, almost every week. But my point was going to be is that Notre Dame will have players move on, position players, skill position players onto the NFL, but they're not the guys that take the top off the defense. They're not Marquise Brown. They're not the 3 or 4 Alabama receivers, Devontae Smith and Henry Ruggs and Jerry Jeudy. They're not Justin Ross or Amari Rogers or T. Higgins. They're not those players. They're really good possession, or when I think possession receiver, I think Hunter Renfrow. Chris Fink's a possession receiver. Chris Claypool's basically a possession receiver. Mack is a tight end. Boykin's their downfield threat, but he's not a burner by any stretch, so they don't have that guy. The Notre Dame offensive line wasn't capable of doing anything with the Clemson defensive line, and we'll see in this championship game whether Alabama can move the defensive line of Clemson. That is a grown-up big man battle, unlike any two units that we could find in college football. The Clemson defensive front against the Alabama offensive front. And so Notre Dame has a good offensive line, and those guys, 2 or 3 of them, will have lengthy careers in the NFL. But they were just overwhelmed by Clemson's front. And Ian Book's a good player. He's not Kyler Murray. He's not Trevor Lawrence. He's not Tua Tagovailoa. He is the least gifted player at his position in the playoffs. But he's a good player. He's Jake Fromm. He is of that ilk and capable of winning a championship if given the right help. And he had no support from the running game. So the point I originally was making, that Notre Dame, if we charted every play in the first half, Notre Dame probably won more plays. They were playing technically more sound football for the most part against Clemson, but there are those explosive plays, and those explosive plays wipe out 7 or 8 marginal plays in which you may have won the battle at the point of attack and stop somebody for just a 2 or 3 yard gain, or your back got 3 or 4 yards and you blocked it well, or maybe 6 or 7 yards. But those Justin Ross plays, they wipe out everything Notre Dame would accomplish. Notre Dame would consistently get the kickoff or get the ball after a punt and move it about 30 yards. They would get 2 or 3 first downs, and they would get to the Clemson 40, 35-yard line, and then Clemson would get serious. And there would be one play, one penalty, one behind the chains, behind the sticks play that the Clemson defense would make, and that would totally take Notre Dame off of its schedule. And Dexter Williams didn't have the kind of room, the kind of space to make any kind of impact in this game. And Ian Book is not the running threat for big chunks of yardage. He was effective breaking contain and getting some first downs with his legs. He's not a statue. But Notre Dame just had, that was the big difference in the game. Explosive, gifted, talented players at the very highest rung. Notre Dame falls short there. And I agree with Brian Kelly. They didn't play their best game. They could have played better. I don't have my Notre Dame Clemson notes in front of me, but there were plays in the first half that I don't believe would have changed the outcome of the game, but would have made it more respectable and would have kept Notre Dame in the game longer. The kickoff that was fumbled, that they could have kept from going out of bounds, Notre Dame would have had the ball at the Clemson 20-yard line. They would have at least most likely kicked a field goal, if not scored a touchdown. The Ian Book fumble. But that's part of football. Hang on to the ball. Catch the ball. There are 3 plays that I can think of in which Notre Dame should have converted a first down, but their receiver dropped the ball. It wasn't a big play by the Clemson defense. The defender wasn't there. He didn't make a strip of the ball, didn't break up the pass. It was a clear drop. So whether you're playing Clemson or you're playing Ball State, if you drop the ball, you don't convert the third down. And who knows what the complexion of the game, how that would be different. Having a first down at midfield versus punting the ball back to Clemson. That changes the game significantly. If Notre Dame goes out there and executes a little bit better, probably up to its standard, they lose this game by 15 or 20 points, not by 27 points. Big deal. They're still not good enough to hang with Clemson. And I think, yes, this score was a bit of an aberration, but not a huge aberration. I think that Clemson would generally be 15 to 20 points better than Notre Dame if they played consistently. If they played every week, and we had a big sample size, we would see that Clemson would go out there and beat them 27-13, and then they beat them 31-17, and then they beat them 34-17, and then they might beat them just 23-20 one week, and then. But this is what can happen when Clemson plays. They probably didn't even play their best game, but Notre Dame certainly didn't. Clemson's better. Clemson's one of the 3 best teams in the country. Ohio State and Oklahoma could claim to be in that mix. But from where I sit, I can't distinguish between Clemson and Georgia. It's a toss-up to me. And until Clemson goes out there in 10 days, 9 days, and beats Alabama head-to-head, I still have to rate Alabama better than Clemson. So Clemson's the 2nd or 3rd best team in the country. And Notre Dame's 7th to 10th or 12th. Wouldn't it be fascinating if we could actually run a simulator and say, okay, Notre Dame play Ohio State. Boom. Notre Dame play Texas. Notre Dame play Washington. And we could line up these teams and see. But we just have to kind of gauge it. And I don't think that Notre Dame's as good as Oklahoma, especially after what we saw out of Oklahoma, getting behind 28-0, then battling back and playing reasonably well against Alabama, starting to slow down. Well, as Reasonable Gump mentioned, the Alabama offense stopped itself, but at least the Oklahoma defense was there to make some tackles and not then let them break away for touchdowns. But the Oklahoma offense started to get it going, and I think Oklahoma's better than Notre Dame. I think Ohio State's better than Notre Dame. And then there's a bunch of teams that it's difficult to tell. I think they're all in a big basket. I think we've got a basket between about 6 and 15. We've got Florida. We've got Michigan. And sure, Florida beat Michigan by 26 points today, but let's be real. Michigan would win that game at full strength on occasion. Again, I'm not saying that they would win every time. I'm not saying that this loss by Michigan was a complete aberration. Maybe Florida's a little bit better, but Michigan was missing 4 or 5 of its best players. So there you have it. For me, it's Alabama, it's Clemson and Georgia. It's Ohio State and Oklahoma. Then it's Notre Dame leading the pack with Central Florida and a whole bunch of other teams like Texas and Michigan and Florida and LSU and possibly Penn State and Washington. And maybe we'll see Washington beat Ohio State, and I'll have to reassess. All right, the number's 860-325-3687, 860-325-3687. Otherwise, I will go to work on a recap video for Alabama, Oklahoma, Clemson, Notre Dame, South Carolina, Virginia, as the ACC and the Cavaliers won 28-0. And, of course, the Michigan-Florida game with the Gators coming out on top. It's Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football. So who do we have on the line?
Hey, Mark, this is Jet 716.
Hey, how you doing, man?
Doing all right, man. You know, enjoying the win. Roll Tide, roll.
Yeah, so what'd you think of it?
I wasn't really too surprised by it. We all knew Oklahoma was going to get their point. I didn't expect it to be in the second half. I didn't expect that Oklahoma was going to get dominated in the first half. I thought that Oklahoma was going to get the lead first and jump off a little bit, and then Alabama was going to make the adjustments in the second half. But yeah, I mean, the one thing that I wasn't really too shocked of was Oklahoma's offensive line. Oklahoma's offensive line had not all year faced the type of caliber defensive line like Alabama has. Quentin Williams, if he didn't show it tonight, he proved tonight that he's the best defensive player in the country. They got 2 guys on him. They got 3 guys on him on one play. He's still getting past them and getting to the quarterback. It's absolutely ridiculous. Christian Miller, Christian Miller, Mac Wilson had, those guys had good games. Isaiah Buggs was really shocked me tonight. Was in the backfoot a lot at the time. Really, I mean, really wasn't too shocking. I mean, Oklahoma has a really, really good offensive line. Like, don't get, they got a good offensive line, but they just didn't face the caliber of, the type of offensive line, defensive line like Alabama has. So that really didn't surprise me. Kyler Murray, man, he's a warrior, man. Alabama, we all know, has struggled against mobile quarterbacks, but this was the most explosive player. Like, just seeing him live, the most explosive player I think I've ever seen. And, do I think, he should go to the NFL? No, I think that he should pursue baseball. But, the kid he's amazing. He's a really, he's a really good quarterback, and I think he did deserve the Heisman Trophy.
When you just mentioned seeing him live, are you talking about you're at the game?
Oh no, this is like I've seen highlights of him. I've never seen an Oklahoma game
okay,
as far as like TV wise this year.
Okay,
yeah, I've seen highlights, but just seeing it live, that was really cool.
You're not watching a whole lot of Big 12 football.
Oh no, they are just no, not this year. I just pretty much the focus just on SEC ball and some Big 10 ball, here and there, but not like nothing, like that. There's also another thing I want to talk to you about real quick. If that's cool.
Sure.
I want to get your opinion on this, and that's pretty much now the playoffs, right? That's a lot of people. I don't know if you've been seeing it, like on Twitter, Facebook. Everybody is now complaining that should the playoff format now change, because for the past 5 years now since this thing has been established, there has always been a blowout. As far and you don't want that. You want you want to determine who the 4 best teams are, and you want to try to get these games that you want these at least competitive. You want these games to be competitive. And now for like the 5th year in a row, I mean, we've had blowouts in every single one of these playoffs. And I know like Notre Dame, Washington, the 1 year Ohio State got in back in 2016. These schools, and now Notre Dame, while you have Georgia and Ohio State waiting, and I don't know if you haven't seen a tweet. I think Nico Hartman made a tweet saying that are these rooms the 4 best teams in the country? Because they just don't look like it. And I know Dwayne Haskins responded, and he responded with a smart comment himself. Do you think that potentially the playoff committee will look at these games and potentially maybe have a different format of how they can choose the 4 best teams?
Well, what are they going to do? They basically have a criteria that's it's a bit mysterious, but we know what the framework is to a certain extent. They're going to select the teams with the best record, basically. Yeah. They've always selected the teams with the best record. If you go undefeated, you're going to make the playoff, number one. If you've got 1 loss, you're going to make the playoff unless there's another 1-loss team there to knock you out. And no 2-loss team has made the playoff. The only 2-loss team that would have made the playoff would have been Auburn last year had they won the SEC championship game. So basically they're selecting the teams with the best records, and then they're deciding between if there's a spillover between 4 and 5, then they have to make a judgment call. And the judgment call has been the last 2 years, basically, that Ohio State has had ugly losses, therefore they left them out. And that, short and simple, is the way they've decided it the last couple of years. And I'm sure they gave some consideration to Georgia. It would, of course, be fascinating to be in the room and to hear the various viewpoints and not just the final result, because I'm sure that there were people in that room that said, Ohio State's got to be in that thing. And I'm sure that there were people in that room that said, Georgia has to be in that thing. Look at the way they just played Alabama. They just outplayed them for 3.5 quarters. They're one of the top 4 teams. If we're going to select the 4 best teams and forget about the record and the conference championships, we've got to put Georgia in.
Okay. Do you think that, because Notre Dame, they're not in the conference, do you think that in the future, they'll start rewarding more Power 5 conference champions more than, independents such as Notre Dame?
I think what they're going to start doing, and what they've already started to do, starting with last year, and even going into 2016 with Ohio State, and then with Alabama last year, and with the selection of, or at least with considering Georgia this year, is they're going to start thinking, hey, we're going to rely on our judgment to select the 4 best teams, regardless of losses versus wins and conference championships. Therefore, we may jump an 11-2 team over a 12-1 team, or we may select a non-conference winner because this thing is becoming a bit stale every year when we have these blowout games because we're going more from a resume standpoint.
Yeah, then like trying to decide like, okay, like what can be the. I mean, the simple solution to this is just add 4 more teams. I mean, we got to have the 18 college football playoff. And, you know, like the one thing I have with the system is that we determined that how good the system was based off 1 year. And it's kind of like, well, I mean, why not try to experiment and try to test like new formats like in there? Like, I think an 18 playoff would be perfect. I think a lot of fans actually like an 18 playoff so that we can have teams like Ohio State and Georgia and potentially UCF. We can get them in there, and then we can try to determine who are seriously the best teams. But as far, I don't know how they're going to go. Of course, I think they'll go back to how the format is this year. But I definitely think they'll think about, do we really have to take into consideration, at least watching these games, should we really decide based on resume, or should we decide, just watching them? Like in Ohio State dominating Michigan, or a Georgia performance against Alabama compared to, let's say, if, we go back to, let's say, 2013 Florida State when we went undefeated, but the majority of those games were so many close games that you just knew that a Florida State was going to be in. They're probably going to lose. Notre Dame is probably going to be the underdog. I mean, for the most part, the majority of college football fans, except for Notre Dame fans, see that Notre Dame is probably going to get blown out tonight by Clemson. I just have a fear factor that that the college football playoff committee, they're going to go away from what they used to what they normally do to now going and just selecting teams based off what they've seen instead of going by the resume.
So the 8 teams would have worked very well this year. Yeah. Because you basically had 4 teams that were selected. You had 2 teams that were left out that had a claim to be just as good as some of the teams that made it, especially Oklahoma. So you had Ohio State and Georgia. Then you had a group of 5 that, again, went undefeated, and you would give them a spot. So you would I would include, regardless of record, I would always include the conference championships. Now, of course, there was talk because of Northwestern and Pitt getting to conference championships this year with 4 and 5 losses, that what the conferences should do is do away with the conference championships and just that the best team in each conference should make it to the playoff. And I understand that line of thinking.
Yeah, that's the one thing I like about the Big 12 conference is that instead of just, I mean, they don't have enough teams anyway to have like divisions, but I love that number 1 versus number 2. Let's see who's the best team in the conference, and whoever wins, that's just, it's the winner. There's no debate about it. I love that.
Yeah, so we would have had Ohio State and Michigan, I guess, rematch. We would have had Clemson take on Syracuse. That would have been a nifty little rematch, even though Clemson would have been a huge favorite. At least it was a team that they struggled against that they would have to play again. Alabama, of course, would have played Georgia. We would have had, we had it in the Big 12. And in the Pac-12, we would have had Washington State, I guess, playing again.
And that just intensifies the rivalry. It makes rivalry week. It kind of makes rivalry week a little bit even more intensive. Having Washington potentially play Washington State. Maybe in the near future, maybe if Tennessee somehow makes it to, let's say they finish second place, makes the Alabama Tennessee or Alabama versus Auburn, makes those games. I mean, I would love to see rivalry games in conference championships, make them more significant.
Well, wait a minute here. We would have the rivalries played, and then sometimes they would have to be rematched if we go with the format of 1 versus 2, we can't predict who's going to be in the conference championship game. So we still have to have the rivalries scheduled, but we might have a rematch the next week. And we almost had that with Oklahoma, West Virginia this year anyway.
Yeah, I totally agree with that one right there. Yeah. Yeah, but anyway, I just want to come on here, man. Just stop by, pretty much tell how I feel about it, man. But hopefully you have the rest of a good night, and I'll still be on the live show, chatting up a little bit with you guys. So.
Absolutely.
On the show, man.
I appreciate the call. You have a good one.
Thank you. You too.
All right. I didn't quite catch the phone call. I think was a bit muffled. Hopefully you could hear the comments. So I didn't catch his handle out of the gate. But I appreciate, I believe it was Mr. Nick Saban, who was not too busy just following that gut-wrenching game in which his defense kind of collapsed there in the fourth quarter. But still won a huge game again there at the Orange Bowl that Mr. Nick Saban still took the time to join the live chat and contribute to Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football. Nick Saban, thank you so much. All right, let's dive into some of the comments here. And also, let's keep the phone lines open. Let me get the number back in there at 860-325-3687. Israel Kelly, Oklahoma should never be in the playoffs. Give them a fake Heisman every year to make them happy. So, Israel, you were not at all impressed with the Oklahoma performance and at least kind of staying in the game? Joshua says, agree, the Big Ten had a down year, but they're still the second best conference by far. Joshua, without crunching numbers and really, really dissecting it, which I will in the offseason, I would tend to agree with you that it's the SEC, it's the Big Ten, and then it's really tough to determine the other three conferences. They're very close. I guess Clemson would really bail out the ACC if we're giving more points and more credit to the top of the conference versus the conference 1 through 10 or 12 or 14. Atheist 4, because Oklahoma, Alabama was never really in doubt. I agree. Nick Saban, again, thank you so much for the contribution. That is for somebody to dip into their pockets, whether that's a penny or $1,000, whatever it is, just to show that gesture is very encouraging. I appreciate it. Thank you so much. What else do we have? Revolutionary 1. Anytime I see somebody's handle for the first time, I like to say, welcome to Mark Rogers TV. You've joined us here at the Voice of College Football, which means, yeah, I'm going to say it. I'm the voice of college football. You guys named me the voice of college football, but I also like to look at it like this. You have a voice. I've got a voice. Everybody I bring on, the best bloggers, broadcasters, and writers in the nation, they, of course, have a voice, and together we are the voice of college football. So, Revolutionary 1, Notre Dame should never be in the playoffs again. I don't care if they go undefeated for the next 5 years. It's an interesting argument when we talk about, and it was talked about during the broadcast about Notre Dame. And on one hand, I understand and I make the argument, hey, this is a new team. This is a different team, whether it's Notre Dame or anybody else, and they should only be judged on what they did this year. They should not be held accountable or have to carry some kind of burden for what happened in 2012. So whether we take the good or bad of a program like an Ohio State, who has a championship pedigree, who has been an elite program, but has let down in certain games the last few years. So sometimes the 2016 loss to Clemson in particular kind of gets moved into evaluations in 2017 and 2018. But at least we've seen Ohio State win big on the big stage recently. Notre Dame, on one hand, I totally agree with the idea and the argument. This is a new team. Do not count against them or for them what's happened in the past. But with Notre Dame, it's just been going on for so long that the two obvious examples would be tonight and the 2012 championship game against Alabama. But even other games in which they've played in BCS bowl games, and not for the championship, but they've been in that top 5 range and had to play in Ohio State in the 06 Fiesta Bowl, or Ohio State in the 16 Fiesta Bowl, or LSU in the 07 Sugar Bowl. And they get beat down and beat down and beat down and beat down. And it's now 0-8 in major bowl games since 1993. Now, of course, what happened in the 90s has nothing to do with now and the talent evaluation, but there seems to be some kind of connection that once Notre Dame fell off near the end of Lou Holtz's run there, that they have never been able to quite recruit at the same level as whoever were the major players at that time. And starting in the late 90s, that meant Florida, Florida State, Ohio State. And then into the 2000s, it meant Texas and Oklahoma and Florida State and Miami and Ohio State. And then once we got to the back half of the 2000s, it still meant Ohio State, but then Alabama and Florida State. And then into the last decade, LSU and Clemson. That Notre Dame has never been able to recruit and produce results at the top of college football. That they haven't been able to do that since 1993. They have not beaten on a big stage in a game that mattered for a championship or a major bowl win one of the top 5 teams in the country. I don't know when the last time in postseason play that Notre Dame beat a top 10 team. They beat LSU last year. LSU was 8-4. 8-4, 9-3. So LSU would have been borderline top 10. Let's check out something. And those of you who watch me on a regular basis know that I take great pride in remembering everybody's records and bowl scores every year. But to save my brain, I just go to the wiki page here. Notre Dame bowl scores. And then this is going to trigger how well they did these particular years. So it's already made it to the wiki. Clemson 30, Notre Dame 3. So they were not able to play with a team that was ranked second in the country. 2 years ago, they played number 7 Ohio State. They lost by 3 scores. Then, of course, the 2012 BCS championship game, 42-14. Brian Kelly and Notre Dame should feel fortunate that what's recorded in the records is 42-14. The game was not even nearly that close. It was so bad. It was 28-0 at half. And then Alabama really, this was not the Alabama of 2018 in which, well, let's just keep throwing it a little bit and running our receivers around and keep the pressure on. No, let's just hand it off. We won the championship. Who cares what the final score is? It ended up being 42-14 after it was 42-0. So there you go. There's another one. And then there's a long line of games in which Notre Dame in postseason play did not play anybody ranked that high. Hawaii unranked, Miami unranked, number 25 Florida State, because they weren't that good, so they weren't making those kind of bowl games. So you've got to go back to back-to-back games against the number 4 teams in the country in 05 and 06, Ohio State and LSU. They lost by 14 and they lost by 27. If you go back to 01, they took on number 5. Get this, kids. Anybody out there under the age of 25, you're not going to believe this. In 2001, the number 5 team in the country playing in the Fiesta Bowl against Notre Dame was number 5 in the country, Oregon State. Final score, Oregon State 41, Notre Dame 9. All right. Other top 5 teams, you've got to go back to, they lost to Florida State, who was number 8 in the Orange Bowl in 96. Yes, we have to, they lost to Colorado the year before, who was number 5 in the country. And again, if you're a young viewer to college football and you don't know your college football history, yes, Colorado was really good at one point, number 5 in the country in 95. We have to go back to 1993 and 94, when in back-to-back Cotton Bowls that Notre Dame defeated Texas A&M 28-3 and 24-21 with Lou Holtz as head coach. And the year prior to that, they defeated Florida, number 3 in the country, in the Sugar Bowl 39-28. Since then, they have lost 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 consecutive games against teams ranked in the top 5 to 10 in the country. And they have lost all those games by at least 14 points. They have lost those games by 32, 14, 27, 28, 16, and 27. That's recent Notre Dame football history since Lou Holtz took them to a national championship in 1988 and then kept them in the national elite category for the next 5 years until 1994. And they were good in 95. They lost an Orange Bowl to Florida State 31-26. So there's a respectable result. I remember that one well with Ron Paulus at quarterback. That's been Notre Dame football for 25 years. They either turn in an 8-4 season and go to the likes of the Sun Bowl, the Hawaii Bowl, the Pinstripe Bowl, and they beat the likes of Miami of Florida, Rutgers, Hawaii, or they go to a national playoff, or they go to a major bowl game and they face LSU, Ohio State, Clemson, Oregon State when they were that good, Alabama, of course, and they lose by 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 scores. That's recent Notre Dame football history. 8-4 or 10-2, 11-1, and let's go play somebody really, really good and get smacked. That's what's been happening. Notre Dame fans, I hate to lay it out like that, but that's basically what's been happening now for 25 years. And I don't know what the answer is. I know that one of the excuses, and it might be a valid one, is that the academic standards are just too tough. All right, what are you guys talking about here? Colorado had 5 downs. Remember, that was not the Colorado team. Nice try, Israel. I know that you're trying to weigh in with a little college football history there. That was the 1990 Colorado team, not the 1995 Colorado team. And that didn't happen against Notre Dame. That happened against Missouri. Should Notre Dame be forced to join a conference? Absolutely, they should be. I was thinking this entire season that if Notre Dame finishes undefeated against a formidable, balanced schedule, not a great schedule, because we've said it a zillion times, Stanford, USC, Florida State, and Virginia Tech were not what they typically are, that Notre Dame would deserve definitely to be in a playoff. And even at 11-1, depending on what happened elsewhere, they might have earned a playoff spot. But I was sitting there on championship Saturday watching the SEC and the Big Ten and all the conference championship games over the weekend, thinking Oklahoma's having to bust its tail against a really good Texas team. Ohio State is having to basically annihilate Northwestern, in which a 21-point win against a good Northwestern team that played Notre Dame within 10 points and within 3 points with 2 minutes left, that Notre Dame team is sitting at home and letting Georgia and Alabama just beat the crap out of each other, and Ohio State have to just completely dominate Northwestern and have Oklahoma have to avenge its loss against Texas, and Notre Dame doesn't have to do anything. That's when I changed my mind. I've never liked Notre Dame not being in a conference. And from a purely football standpoint, I don't care about the other sports. I used to watch college basketball. I don't anymore. I don't care about any other sports. This is not a reasonable, realistic conversation. This is what would be best for college football, is that Notre Dame would play in the Big Ten. They don't have rivalries with teams in the ACC. They don't belong in the ACC. They're in Indiana. They're not on the Atlantic coast. And I know that Louisville's not, and Pittsburgh's not, and Syracuse is not, but there's at least some regional connection there to a certain extent. But to have an Indiana school play in the Atlantic Coast Conference is stupid. But I would rather see Notre Dame join the ACC than anything. And of course, they've already tied themselves to the ACC in the other sports. So that's most likely, if they ever join a conference, that is going to be the one that they will join. But from a purely traditional and football standpoint, and to see what would make the most sense from a football tradition standpoint, from a competitive standpoint, and from a geographic standpoint, Notre Dame should be in the Big Ten. They have long-standing rivalries with Michigan, Michigan State, and Purdue. And they are sitting right there in the middle of Indiana with Purdue and Indiana close to Ohio State, Michigan, Michigan State, Illinois, and the rest of the Big Ten. That's where Notre Dame belongs, playing football in the Big Ten. The way things stand, of course, contractually, is that it would be an easier transition for them to go into the ACC. And the annihilation that we saw today would have been played in Charlotte a month ago in the ACC championship game. And we would have said, oh, Notre Dame had a really good season. They won the ACC Coastal Division. They beat all those teams like Duke and Pitt and Miami. And they're good. They're decent. But you know what? They're not anywhere close to being prepared to play in a college football playoff, because Clemson just beat them 30-3 in the ACC championship game. Oh, we got a spot for you, Ohio State. You went 12-1 and won the Big Ten championship game. And over the last 2 weeks, you have obliterated Michigan and Northwestern. Therefore, we don't have to give a spot to Notre Dame, who did not deserve it, who was not good enough. I shouldn't say they didn't deserve it. They went 12-0, but they proved not to be good enough. And that doesn't automatically mean that Ohio State would go and play a competitive game against Clemson. But they did win the Big Ten championship. And in the year in which they did not win the Big Ten championship, they got blasted by Clemson. So maybe they shouldn't have been there then. But then they, ironically for Ohio State, in 2016, they don't win the Big Ten championship, don't even get to the Big Ten championship game, and they make the playoff. The next 2 years, they win the Big Ten championship. Last year, they beat the likes of, in 2017, Wisconsin, Michigan, Michigan State, Penn State, but they don't get to the college football playoff. This year, they go 12-1. They beat the likes of Michigan, Michigan State, Penn State, Northwestern, TCU, who wasn't that good, but they did win a bowl game, and they don't get to the college football playoff. Is this going to continue with Ohio State? We've had this playoff for 5 years, and every year they have been the team of controversy. 2014, they squeaked in at number 4. 2015, they barely missed, even though most people thought they were definitely one of the top 4 teams in the country, but they didn't earn it. They didn't win the Big Ten championship. They finished number 5 before the playoffs. 2016, they squeaked in as the first non-conference champion to make the playoff at number 4. 2017, they win the Big Ten championship, but they got blown out by Iowa. They missed the playoff at number 5. This year, Big Ten champion, 12-1, but they get squeezed out by Oklahoma and actually Georgia. But basically, they were the team that was considered by most, along with Oklahoma, for that to have been the decision. And again, Ohio State right on the borderline. Ryan Day, try to keep that up. The Big Ten is overrated this year, right, Purdue? Michigan? Okay, Drake, when you make those comments, you need to balance it out. So when I make a point here, I at least give the full picture. So we need to mention Minnesota, a winner, and we need to mention Wisconsin. Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football. Who's on the line?
Hey, Mark, it's 2KJ.
Hey, 2KJ. How are you?
Doing good. How about you?
I'm good. What you got for me?
I completely agree with you because I feel like every time Notre Dame, well, in the past, past few times that Notre Dame has gone undefeated, it's due to the fact that, yeah, they play, these teams like Stanford and Virginia Tech, and a couple other teams that I just can't think of right now. But usually when they go undefeated, it's because those teams all have down years. And, when Northwestern has you within 3, USC hands you the game, I just completely agree with you on they should be forced to join a conference, and I don't think they should have made it this year just with some of the squeak-by wins they got and the fact that, yeah, they went undefeated. That's hard to do in college football. They're a top 10 team in my opinion, but they're not a top 4 team.
So 2KJ, between what you're saying and what I'm saying, I think we put together a really good point. So I'm going to extend it just another step. What happens when you build a national schedule like Notre Dame does is that you run the risk of a collection of those teams just being ridiculously good in any given year, and your schedule's brutal. Or in a year like that, like this year, you run the chance that a bunch of those teams like USC, Florida State, Virginia Tech, and Stanford are going to be slightly down or way down. And then you marginalize the schedule, because what happens is when you play in a conference, you play the best and the worst. You play the whole conference. So you've got to play the top of the conference and the middle and the bottom, or at least a representation of all those facets. So you might get the light touch of the Kansas game or the Rutgers game that Notre Dame avoids for the most part. But you also have to play Penn State and Michigan State, or you have to play Georgia and Florida and Kentucky and South Carolina, or you have to play USC and Washington and Stanford and Oregon. You have to play at least most of the best teams in a conference. Therefore, you're forced to play near elite teams versus playing a national schedule. If things break your way, then you get a bunch of 6 and 6 and 7 and 5 teams like they did this year.
Yeah. Do you think it was fair to expect that it wouldn't have been a close game versus Clemson? Because I know some Notre Dame fans were telling me that, it's just ignorant to say they didn't belong because they went undefeated. But, who did they beat? That there are teams they beat that they barely beat that didn't make a bowl game. So it's like, I can't understand, them making it and chilling, when Alabama and Georgia and Texas and Oklahoma and, Ohio State and Northwestern are just beating up on each other,
Yeah, you make a good point about the USC game in particular. And USC, of course, has a talented roster, but USC was a bit of a mess this year. And I watched every play of that game. And USC, they could have beat Notre Dame. They basically shot themselves in the foot over and over and over. But in terms of watching Notre Dame play Clemson today, you could clearly see a huge gap in talent, speed, athleticism. Watching Notre Dame and USC, even though Notre Dame's the undefeated team at 12-0 and USC's the 5-7 team, if we didn't keep score and just watched them play, we wouldn't be able to tell which team was 12-0 and which team was 5-7. USC sometimes looked like the undefeated team and looked like the better team. There wasn't much separation between those two teams. USC just made a lot of mistakes that cost them the game, but basically they were in the game the whole way. It's difficult to completely answer your question, because if we're going to take it to this extreme where we're going to leave a committee and give them the power to select whomever they want, regardless, where they don't even have to make an argument and say, well, we selected them because they won a conference championship and they checked off boxes A through D, where they just say, you know what, we're selecting the 4 best teams. You know what, Notre Dame went undefeated this year, but we don't think they're one of the 4 best teams, so they're out. that would be a difficult sell for College Football Nation because we want to reward teams for winning games. To let a committee leave out a team that went undefeated against a Power 5 schedule in place of maybe a team that lost 2 games. It just doesn't seem right.
Yeah. I mean, no matter what we do, you know, whether it's the BCS, whether it's the playoff, there's always going to be, you know, a team that's put out, and there's always going to be complaining. But, you know, you really want to reduce that because you know you're not going to be able to do it 100%. But you want to reduce that, you know, to as much as you can. On SG1 Sports channel, I saw one of his videos, and he was saying that we should have like a 16 playoff where I think it was like 5 conference champions or 4, it was something like that. And then you have like 1 or 2 wild card teams like a Notre Dame that could get in if, you know, they went undefeated and they looked, you know, good. Or, you know, say like a team like Ohio State, say like this year, if they didn't win their conference, but they looked really good all year, you could put them in, you know, something like that.
Okay. There's a huge issue with having 6 teams. Do you know what that is?
I literally just drew a blank because I was about to say one of the cons of that. Go ahead.
Yeah, we don't want 6 teams. The reason we don't want 6 teams is because we'll be doing nothing but arguing over which 2 teams get a bye. And so if you would look over the course of the college football playoff since 2014 to determine what 6 teams make it would be one thing, but to determine which 6 teams make it and which 2 gets a bye, that would be, you talk about controversy, because you're basically giving those 2 teams a huge advantage. I'm completely against 6 teams. I don't believe in buys. The NFL is a different sort. Those teams earned buys based on winning division championships versus wild cards. And we don't have that in college football. So unless you want to give 5 buys to 5 conference champions, and then you've got a completely wiped out weird system. I think you've got to go with 8 teams, and you've got to include all the conference champions if you're going to go with 8 teams at least. If injuries didn't matter, and if it didn't matter how much we kept these kids out of class, I say that we go to 16 teams and we include all 10 conferences, because right now it's hypocritical to rank the group of 5 teams in the playoff selection committee's rankings, but not give them a chance to play for a national championship.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, well, maybe here, well, if you had 1 versus 6, 2 versus 5, and then 3 versus 4, would you agree if you had 6 teams and they played it that way?
Then what happens the next week?
Well, then you have here.
You have 3 teams.
I haven't thought about this. This was on the fly. Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, you can't play a 6-team tournament.
That wouldn't work.
You have to play 4, 8, 16. You have to play multiples of, you can only play 2, 4, 8, 16, 32.
Yeah.
Otherwise,
there's going to be a debate no matter what if there's 6 teams on who gets a bye.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't like the 6 teams.
And yeah, that doesn't. There's some definite big cons for that. With the bowl system and how, you know, they match up teams for, you know, the Rose Bowl and the Sugar Bowl and stuff like that. Do you think it should just be 5 plays 6, 7 plays 8, you know, 9 plays 10, like that? So you have all the top teams, well, all the considered top teams, you know, playing against each other.
So you would like to see Ohio State and Georgia play, and then have Washington and Texas play?
Yeah, that would be fun to watch. You know, not Ohio State, Washington, and I think Ohio State's gonna beat Washington handily, but I mean, you never know. So and like Georgia, Texas, I feel like Georgia's gonna beat Texas easily. Maybe not like blow them out, like, but I think they're gonna win. So, because my dad went to Alabama, so.
Very nice. So 2KJ, old guys like me, we tend to embrace the traditions of college football. And this playoff system has pretty much obliterated a lot of traditions, but still, there is something special. I think it's been downgraded considerably, but still special about there being bowl ties to certain conferences. So traditionally, for decades and decades and decades, going back to the 1940s and before then, the Pac-12 champion and the Big Ten champion play in the Rose Bowl, and the SEC champion plays in the Sugar Bowl. Again, the playoffs have obliterated that, and the BCS championship game before that. So I get your point. We would have better matchups if we just rank the teams and then base the bowl matchups on the rankings. But we would pretty much, I don't even know why we would name these bowl games what they're named now, because traditionally there are conference tie-ins to these bowl games. The Sugar Bowl has its roots, its name in sugarcane being planted and raised in the South, and that being a Southern thing. The Rose Bowl being in Pasadena, the city of roses. And therefore, you might as well just call them bowl game number 1, bowl game number 2, bowl game number 3, and line up the rankings and set up our matchups. And maybe that's the way we should do it. But if we're going to go by the rankings and not go by the traditional bowl matchups, again, the playoffs have already torn that down to a certain extent, and maybe we should just do away with the whole thing. I sometimes think the way people talk that we should just obliterate all the conferences and just have everybody be an independent and just make up a schedule for everyone. And we'll just select and we'll give everybody a balanced schedule based on the previous season. And everyone will play the same schedule difficulty, and they won't play a regional schedule. And then we'll just take the top 8 teams and we'll play a playoff.
Yeah, that could be interesting, but there would be some.
I really don't want to do that,
tradition.
but
Yeah, I mean, there would also be some downfalls in tradition because you may not have Alabama and Auburn playing, Ohio State and Michigan playing. Although maybe you'd have some bending the rules with independence and just scheduling those teams every year, kind of like Notre Dame with the ACC teams they schedule. But I mean, yeah, there's some pros to that, but there's some definite cons.
yeah, I'm actually being a bit facetious. I do not want the conferences to go away. I would rather have the conferences be credited and be respected for their championships meaning something, rather than what we're doing now, letting 13 people dictate who they think are the 4 best teams in the country.
Yeah, and I mean, some of those people have biases, coming from certain universities. So I feel like it's kind of, I don't understand why we have some people in the committee who, have come from universities that I can't think of off the top of my head, but universities that can contend. Like the bias in some of the people. Yeah, they may be unbiased, but from a fan, we don't know.
So what used to happen, and your dad has probably explained this to you, is that before 1998, everyone would go to their bowl games. So the Big Ten and the Pac-12 would play their championships in the Rose Bowl, and the SEC would play an at-large team that was selected, one of the highest-ranked teams in the country, in the Sugar Bowl, and the Orange Bowl would be the Big 12 champion, who was then the Big 8 champion, would play an at-large team, and the Southwest Conference, which no longer exists, but had at the time Texas and Arkansas and a lot of other teams from the Southwest in it, would play in the Cotton Bowl and host the Cotton Bowl. And basically, if you were somebody like me, you'd watch all these games on New Year's night, the Sugar Bowl, the Orange Bowl. The Rose Bowl was always played about 5 o'clock, and then the late night games were the Sugar Bowl and the Orange Bowl. Earlier in the day, that was the Fiesta Bowl and the Cotton Bowl. And we'd actually, 2KJ, have to get up the next day, get the newspaper, and open it up and find out who won the national championship, because the Associated Press writers and the USA Today coaches poll would come out in the newspaper the next day, and we would go to bed just kind of guessing who won the national championship.
Yeah, I've heard of that. And that could, I mean, there's so many ways, we could do this, but figuring out the best way, it's going to be so tough,
Yeah, so it's really I get your point. There is no perfect system because there's 130 teams out there and there's about 68 in the Power 5, so there's just way too many teams for them to play enough games against each other to be measured equal or to be measured fairly like the NFL where you only have 32 teams and they play 16 games. So they play against each other so much it's reasonable to be able to say, well, their 11-5 record is definitely better than their a 9-7 record because they played so many of the same teams. Where in college football, there's just it's just too spread out. But there is a sensible way to do it, and the sensible way is not to have 13 people determine that they're going to try to fit 5 conferences and then all these extra teams like Central Florida and Notre Dame into a 4-team playoff, because that definitely doesn't work.
Yeah, so that's mostly it for me.
All right, 2KJ. You have a good one as well. Enjoy the championship game.
All right. See you.
All right. No 6-team playoffs, please. Before anybody proposes a 6-team playoff, do me a favor and go through every season and you tell me who the 6 teams are going to be and who the 2 teams with byes are going to be and why those 2 teams are going to receive byes. So I'm guessing this year that Alabama and Clemson would receive the byes only because Notre Dame did not play in a conference. Therefore, they didn't play a conference championship game and did not have a 13th win. Okay, that kind of makes sense. In 2017, Clemson was the 1, Alabama was the 4, Georgia and Oklahoma were the 2 and 3s. Okay. Clemson won the ACC, they lost 1 game. Georgia won the SEC, they lost 1 game. Oklahoma won the Big 12, they lost 1 game. Okay, which 2 teams out of those 3 get the byes? Because that's a huge decision to make, to tell one team, oh, you've got to play Alabama in the first round. You don't get to play anyone. You get to sit home and wait for the winner of the Alabama and Clemson game and wait for them to beat up on each other, and then you get to play the winner. No, that's not the way to do it. That makes absolutely no sense. It doesn't make any sense. I don't even know one positive point in it. I don't even know one point to defend it. It's not like there's 3 points in favor of a 16 playoff and there's like 4 points against it. There's 0 points in favor of a 16 playoff and there's 57 points against it. Or maybe there's just one really good point in that it's not fair. And it can't be determined logically who the 2 teams would be to receive byes. All right. What else do you guys have in here? I see people are talking about the NBA. For anybody who gets into this live college football chat and starts talking about the NBA, you guys should automatically have to donate $50. Nick Saban is 45 years old. Clemson is a lot better than Alabama, according to Brady Hargrove. Brady, I see your handle in the live chat for the very first time. Welcome to Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football. Thank you so much for joining us. I would love to know who you root for, probably Clemson, but maybe I'm wrong. And how long you've been watching the channel. Notre Dame would be a 9-win team in the Big Ten. Probably. So they did beat Michigan. They did beat Northwestern. But they would have to run through that grind for 9 games. I don't know if this team would have lost 3 games in the Big Ten. So are you saying that they would have gone 6-3 in the Big Ten and 9-3 overall, or maybe lost a non-conference game against USC or somebody like that? But of course, they beat USC. Notre Dame was pretty good. So let's not drop Notre Dame into just they're trash, they're horrible. Yes, they were outclassed today for a full quarter and about half of the second quarter. They played with Clemson. They had a 3-3 game, and they were probably playing better play to play. But then they made some mistakes combined with Clemson's explosiveness, and it was not a game after that. I heard some people saying, and this came out of the mouth of Brian Kelly, and I referenced this a few minutes ago, that he really wanted to talk up the point that we just didn't play well. We didn't execute. It has nothing to do with talent or athleticism or speed like it did after the Alabama championship game in 2012, in which I walked off the field and felt as though, wow, we've got a lot of player development to do, and we've got a lot of recruiting to upgrade. And Brian Kelly's probably half right when he makes that statement. This Notre Dame team is probably closer to the elite than that Notre Dame team that from the very first drive of the game was slaughtered by Alabama. This at least took about 20 to 25 minutes of game time to take hold. And they had about 3 or 4 plays there that if it would have turned out better for Notre Dame, that they could have stayed in the game at least through the half. They could have gotten to the half at maybe 9-6 instead of giving up those 2 touchdowns. Well, then it turned out to be a 3rd touchdown with the 2 seconds left to make it 23-3. So it went from 3-3 to 23-3 like that. But Brian Kelly, again, you are not as good as Clemson. You didn't just fail to execute. Yes, you didn't play a good game. You would normally play Clemson better than that, but not 27 points better. Joshua, should a 2-loss team make the playoff? So why does everybody have an issue with 2 losses? This is what I don't understand. Nobody has an issue with 1 loss. It's not like, well, if you lose a game, you're out. You've got to go undefeated to make the playoff. Well, that's because we've got to fill 4 slots, and we never have 4 undefeated teams. So why is there something magical about going from 1 loss to 2 losses? There's nothing magical about going from 0 losses to 1 loss. Therefore, why can't we have a 2-loss team in the playoff? Last year, understand, Joshua, that Auburn was playing in the SEC championship game with 2 losses. Had they won, they would have been in the college football playoff with 2 losses. And it's going to happen whether it's next year or some year in the next 5, that there will be a 2-loss team that will make the college football playoff. Bank on it. There will be a 2-loss team in the playoff. All right. Cheryl doesn't believe me. Cheryl thinks I'm delusional. Yeah, ESPN never mentioned Georgia losing to LSU. Atheist for the cause going to 2 losses makes more of an argument for a group of 5 team, though. So I think you guys are talking about Georgia, I'm guessing. And because Clemson crushed Notre Dame, should Georgia have been there? Georgia doesn't deserve to be there. They are not a conference champion and lost to shitty LSU by 20, and they lost twice. USCC, yes, kissers must be on drugs to think Georgia deserves a college football playoff bid. So I don't know that a whole lot of people, Deep Barrett, are saying that Georgia deserved it, but the argument can be made that they're one of the 4 best teams in the country. So there's a difference there. Did they earn it? No. But did Alabama earn it last year? They didn't win a conference. Did Ohio State earn it in 2016? They didn't win a conference championship. No, Georgia was a more worthy opponent than Ohio State. Clemson would have embarrassed Ohio State, but not Georgia. All right, Jimmy C., you understand when you say that, that's all conjecture. That's your opinion, which we all have them, of course. Like some other things, we all have them, opinions. So that's your opinion. But that's not like set in stone that Ohio State would have gotten blown out by Clemson, but Georgia would not have. Yes, I'm accepting calls. 860-325-3687. 860-325-3687. 860-325-3687. 16 playoff is great. I want to call in and tell you why, Mark. All right. MCD Sports 4. Tell me. Why is a 6-team playoff good? Why does that make sense? It makes no sense. None. 16 is too much. All right. Let me put the number in the chat. I don't know if you folks who wanted to call in are still around. Okay, let me explain something about 16 teams and why that would make sense on one hand. And I understand from a competitive standpoint, it doesn't make sense because of what we saw tonight. If Notre Dame can't hang with Clemson and we have these routes every year, then obviously if we have 16 teams in a playoff, many of those teams are going to get blown out. But let's understand what's going on right now. We have 10 conferences. And we have a section of college football that are not, oh, shoot. I've got an issue with the phone that's not, hang on just a second. Would you please call back because I cannot put this on speaker the way it's displayed. Oh, shoot. Then came the display with the speaker. All right. Here we go. I really need to work out this phone system, and therefore I would be able to put you guys on hold, and then I could explain my 16-team playoff. Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football. Who's on the line?
Hi there. This is Deep Barat.
Deep Barat.
Yeah.
I always mispronounce your name.
Yep.
Deep Barat. I'll have to remember that. How you doing tonight?
Yeah. Lovely. It was a lovely couple games.
Oh, yes.
And,
fascinating.
Obviously, I think I've kind of made my allegiances clear in the chats that I've been engaged with in your channel in the past. As a Texas fan, it is a big win for us, considering that Oklahoma did not win, this particular game against Alabama. Huge win for us. But I guess you could say it's bad for the Big 12 because the Big 12 is now 0-3 in the college football playoff.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess kind of bounce on that. Do you think that a 4-team playoff is good? And then B, I kind of agree with you, based on the previous conversation that you had, that, a 6-team playoff just would not be good or work, period, simply because, this is college football and it's not pro, where, you have, 16-game, regular season with divisions, seeding and all that. Like it just would not work out. I'm not just trying to say like I'm a traditionalist, but I kind of like the BCS system, right? Because essentially, you're using three different evaluation methods. You're using the computer, you're using coaches pool, and then you're also, I think you're aggregating the computer, the coach. There's something else. I think it was the AP pool. There's a couple of different metrics that they were using and combining it into one. And a lot of people back then, there was some controversy in some years, but for the most part, people generally accepted the norm. And then, this college football playoff was created, and there's like these two games that these teams have to play extra. Like, I just kind of want to hear your perspective on BCS or something similar, right? Like, why not have a 2-team playoff? Like, why have a 4-team playoff? Why have an 8-team playoff? Why not just have a 2-team one game or even multiple games among the two best teams that are determined at the end of the regular season. But yeah, I mean, as for my opinion, I think the system's fine. But I think that after 2026, I don't know when the TV contract ends, but I think that they're gonna come up with some new metric or some new system. So just wanted to get your perspective on that, Mark. And I just have to say it. As a Texas fan, OU still sucks.
Well, you had to get that in, and you're a college football fan, so this is what it's all about, is having fun and trashing the opponent. So if you can't make it to the college football playoff, then you enjoy seeing Oklahoma go down. That's good stuff. So, Deep, pronounce your last part of your handle one more time. I already forgot it. Oh, he hung up on me.
It's
Barat. Deep Barat. I'm going to have to phonetically write that down, so I've got that handy. All right, let's dive into this. So apparently you've never heard me rail on the BCS because I've done it many times. So what's also interesting is I would like to know your age, if you don't mind. You're 25. So to you, the BCS is tradition. So when I think tradition, I think pre-BCS because we're different ages. So here are the issues I had with the BCS, is that in 18 years, I believe, of the BCS, 1998 through 13, 16 years of the BCS, there were very few years, I would argue no years, but I can understand a few times in which there was a clear-cut two teams that separated themselves as undefeated teams that should play in the championship game. Every year, there was a huge controversy over which teams should be in, and there were teams left out that had just as strong of resume as one of the two teams, if not both of the teams that were selected to go in. So, for example, I'll just give you one example. The very first year of the BCS in 1998, I don't know if you're familiar with what happened in 1998.
Not particularly.
Okay.
No.
So Tennessee went undefeated. They were the only major team in a Power 5 conference that went undefeated. So fine, Tennessee's number one. All right. Ohio State, Wisconsin, Arizona, UCLA, Kansas State, and Florida State. What did I just name? 6 teams all went 10-1. 6 teams went 10-1. So how do we decide who plays in the championship game?
Well, I mean, they're still using the same factors today, right? Like strength of schedule, strength of record, who the opponent was, win loss.
Yeah, but at least they've got some play. At least they've got 3 spots. At least they've got 3 other spots to do that with, as opposed to 6 teams with the same exact resume, or at least the same record, playing in Power 5 leagues, and then trying to determine. And so what was funny about the BCS that particular year, and this is the very first year, is the BCS formula actually selected the team that had the worst loss of those 6 teams. Florida State lost to a 6-5 North Carolina State team, 24-7. And they played in what was basically considered the worst conference, the ACC, and that's what the BCS spit out. Florida State's number 2. And so Florida State went to the national championship game. So it ensued from there every year that there was a big problem with the BCS formula. And what else happened was that every year that there would be a controversy, that they would go in, whoever controlled the BCS, I don't remember at the time, would go in and tweak it, because they would discover some kind of fallacy with the BCS, with the formula that resulted in. So in 2001, for example, Nebraska lost its conference championship 62-36 to Colorado. Were annihilated in their conference championship game, and they still hung on to the number 2 spot in America and played in the national championship game. 2 years later, Oklahoma lost the Big 12 championship game 35-7 to Kansas State, but still, based on the formula, held on to the number 2 ranking in the country, actually held on to the number 1 ranking, if you can believe that, losing their conference championship by 4 touchdowns and made it to the national championship game. This happened year after year after year.
Yeah, and that's part of the system, I suppose, right? But is the computer going to be able to determine that better than 15 subjective people in a committee, right? I mean, that's something that you have to evaluate. One could make a very serious argument about Ohio State, right? What happened to Ohio State this year? It's just terrible. Now, would Ohio State have that even a better game? Absolutely, we don't know that, but it's a very likely scenario that, or not likely, but a very possible scenario, right? Ohio State versus Alabama would have been a much better game. Or even forget about Ohio State and Alabama, right? You could have had Ohio State and Clemson, right? So that's just my opinion, right? I mean, I think that it's a work in progress. I also think that independence should be kind of getting rid of, right? I mean, Notre Dame is a Power 5 kind of team, right? They play a Power 5 conference, but they don't play a 13th data point. They're not in a conference either, right? So those two things kind of expose them year after year. And this isn't even the first year. This happened in 2012 as well, right? I mean, you saw what happened there. That was under the old BCS system. So, I mean, it is what it is. But it was just for a neutral spectator, right? The game was just terrible.
Yeah, so the one thing that you said that makes total sense in theory, but we saw it play out, and in my opinion, again, and I'm not a supporter of the BCS, but in theory, I understood the concept that, okay, well, we're going to take the best of both worlds, meaning that we're going to have humans who are subjective, who can put things into context, rank these teams, but we're also going to take computers who are completely, of course, objective and just take metrics and statistics and records and strength of schedule and put that together. And we're going to put those two formulas together. But unfortunately, there were basically 3 systems at work. They would take there were like 19 different computer models, and they put them all together and mixed all those rankings together to spit out one computer ranking. And then they had the coaches' rankings, the coaches' poll, and then they had the writers' poll. And so the humans still held 2/3 of the formula of the BCS rankings. So the humans still controlled it. And it was proven year to year that the human vote overrode what the computers had to say anyway.
Right. Hello?
Yep.
Yeah, so, there are a lot of different, I guess, methods, like different systems that people could incorporate, right? But I guess at the end of the day, college football is going to remain broken in one way, shape, or form or another, right? One could make a very strong argument that the winner of the college football playoff trophy is the deserving national champion of the country. But at the end of the day, right, I mean, a lot of these college football national titles that have been claimed historically over the years, right, they've been claimed national championships where there's been, in many years, multiple national champions. And so, I mean, can we really say, right, that the winner of XYZ trophy or XYZ poll at the end of the year is really the national champion of the country? I mean, UCF claimed one last year too, right? I mean, and I know that you can say that Alabama's a much better team, but I mean, do we really know that? Like, it's just, I mean, you have to find reason and ration, I guess, with one system or another.
Well, you've probably heard me say it for as many times as I see you on these live chats that I just thought it was poetic justice that not only did Central Florida go undefeated and be able to say, okay, we went undefeated and the quote unquote national champion did not, but they actually beat the team in the Peach Bowl, Auburn, that beat the two teams that played in the national championship game. And they not only beat them, but they beat them on the same field that the national championship game was played on. I just thought it was just poetic justice. I just thought it was beautiful the way that played out.
Do you think they deserved to claim that national championship?
Well, I don't reasonably think that they were the best team in the country. No, but I don't think it should matter what I think. I believe that they won. They did everything within their power to win a national championship. They weren't given the opportunity to prove it. And then they went and played a team that beat the two teams that played in the national championship game. So if it's not like they were relegated to go play Boise State, another group of 5 team. They did everything within their power. So absolutely, before I heard that Central Florida raised a banner and threw a parade and did all the things that they did, I was telling people left and right, if I was the president of UCF, I would raise a banner and throw a parade and declare myself the national champion. We did everything we possibly could. We were not given an opportunity. And then when we were matched up against a team that beat the two teams in the national championship game, what did we do? We went out and beat them. Sure, I'd raise a banner.
Okay, so that brings up two very important points that I have. These are, I guess, my last points.
Sure.
The conversation is one, tomorrow, right? I mean, UCF went 12-0 this year. Okay, they did beat Pitt. Do you think that if they go 13-0, if they beat LSU tomorrow, do you think they deserve to claim another national championship? And do you think they will? And if they do, I mean, the same thing's going to happen, right? Another parade, another CMP, and the same process repeats itself. And then kind of to piggyback off of that, kind of the second question is that, for the last, I think, 4 years, we've been seeing nothing but Alabama and Clemson, right, in the national championship game.
Sure.
Or college football playoff. They were in the college football playoff semifinal last year.
Yep.
But usually it's one of these two teams that has become the champion. And obviously it makes sense, right? I mean, they have some of the best recruits in the country. They have a lot of money coming into their programs and some base facilities. And on top of that, I would argue that they have the two best current coaches in the game, which is Nick Saban and Dabo Swinney.
Yep.
The question then becomes, for people like you and me and probably most of the people watching as spectators on your show and even the rest of the country, how many more years do you think we're going to see this? How long do you think the trend is going to continue where we see the same teams again and again in the playoff every year and again kind of in that national championship bubble, particularly with Alabama and Clemson? And I guess to kind of finish things off, like if Saban leaves Alabama, I mean, is it over? I mean, because he's getting older, right? I mean, 67, 68 next year. So just want to get your perspective on that.
Well, it's a great question. It's a great question because I must hear a half a dozen times a year how much parity there is in college football. I hear this comment made, and I don't know where it comes from, because there's less parity than probably there's ever been, or at least in modern times there's ever been. Go through the 1980s, the 1990s, and in any particular year, if you wanted to select who was going to win the national championship, it was a fairly difficult task. Sure, you had a collection of 7 or 8 teams that you would say, okay, well, Ohio State's going to be in it, and Florida State and Miami at the time, if this was the 1990s, let's say, and Nebraska's really good. And you had a collection, and you had about an 80 or 90% chance of, if you selected 7 or 8 teams, of hitting the national champion at the beginning of the season. Now it's become Clemson and Alabama, and then by extension, just maybe a couple more slots given to Georgia, Ohio State, and Oklahoma. And we've pretty much covered with those 5 schools everything relevant that's happened in college football over the last 5 or 6 years has been covered right there. So it seems to be getting worse.
Forget about Oregon and Ohio State, but I see what you're saying.
Yeah. Yeah. So
do you see it as an ongoing trend, though? Like maybe in 5 years, or another 4 years, or another 10 years, right? I mean, people say Saban's contract is till 2025, which is a long way to go. And it makes no sense for the guy to retire either, right? I mean, he keeps winning year after year. So, and then look at Clemson, right? I mean, Clemson keeps appearing, if not winning every year. And their coach is very young. He's 49. So, how long can he go? But, I mean, tides do change over time. So we may see some differences, but it seems like the trend is going to continue. And I don't know how the rest of the country is going to react to that, right? I mean, every year, a lot of people that I talk to, they complain it's the same national championship. It's the same teams, the same type of teams. Now, granted, you mentioned Georgia, right? But Georgia just appeared last year, and they didn't even appear this year. Ohio State had multiple appearances. Michigan State had an appearance. I mean, Oregon made it to the national championship game. So we've seen some diversity, right? But again, it's like when it comes to the final two teams, right? It's the same two teams every year.
Well, the reason I mentioned Ohio State and Oklahoma and now Georgia is because, yeah, Georgia did make the national championship game and came within a couple plays of winning the national championship last year. And by any reasonable measurement of performance on the field against Alabama in the SEC championship game, it's reasonable to argue that Georgia is still one of the top 2 or 3 teams in the country. For Ohio State, it's that even when they haven't made the playoff, they've been basically the first team out. They have been on the borderline for 5 consecutive years to either make it or not make it. So they're always in contention. Oklahoma has been in contention now for 3 or 4 years and been in the playoff or just missed the playoff, as they did in 2016. So that's the only reason I mentioned a few other teams as being right below that Alabama-Clemson line. But yeah, it to me, I'm not as excited to watch a national championship game with Clemson and Alabama next week as I would be if it were Georgia and Michigan, or I don't know, Florida State and USC, or just something different. Now, I would say that Alabama has less of a chance than Clemson of maintaining dominance for the fact that they play in a tougher conference with schools that have, when you look at possible contenders to arrive at that elite status, you've got to look at tradition, you've got to look at resources and money and recruiting footprint. And there are schools in the SEC that have the opportunity to match Alabama. LSU, Texas A&M, Georgia, Auburn, Florida. Clemson, though, unless Florida State gets its act together, in no conceivable way do any of us expect Pitt or Georgia Tech or North Carolina or Wake Forest or North Carolina State to rise up and become some kind of power all of a sudden. While in the SEC, there's about 5 or 6 programs that have proven that they have the resources and the capability to do that. But in the ACC, Florida State's the only school, and I would even argue Miami is proving incapable of doing that. So that's where Clemson's kind of protected. They almost have a free path to the playoff, the way things stand right now.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I mean, the way I see it, I think it's probably going to be that way for at least another 5 years. It may not be that these two teams be the champion every year, which hopefully does not happen, to be honest with you, for the sake of the rest of the country. But I do think that because of the two coaches that are there, and because of the resources and the money and just everything that's flowing into these programs and the recruits too, right? I do think that it's more than likely that we see these two teams appear every year in the playoff, at least for several years. I mean, at least the next 3 or 4. Well, speaking of which, do you have any opinion on when Nick Saban would retire. Do you think that he's going to retire? Or is he just going to continue going?
He seems to be in excellent health, and he's 68 years old. And being 68 years old now versus being 68 years old when Bear Bryant was 68 years old, or just people just take care of themselves better. So I could see him coaching for 5 or 6, 7 years easily. Joe Paterno, Bobby Bowden, those guys were into their 80s. They were roughly 80 years old, if I'm not mistaken, right in that range when they were near the end.
He looks like the type of guy that loves the job, right?
Absolutely.
He's not the type of guy who likes retirement. And it's not even a money thing. I think he has more than enough money to live several lifetimes. But yeah, I mean, it's just. I mean, I don't think it's unfair to the rest of the country because they're not doing anything illegal. But it's just, it's a little deflating. But I mean, you never know, right? I mean, there could be that team that dethrones them. I wouldn't necessarily say Clemson is a team that dethroned them. I mean, they did win once against them, but it doesn't take away from the Alabama dynasty that's appeared ever since 2009, right? I mean, ever since that national championship game. My school, my alma mater, right, Texas, lost. It was the beginning of Alabama. I guess you could say the downfall of Texas. And the tides have turned, right? I mean, you've seen, Alabama being a completely irrelevant program between 1993 and 2008. I mean, they had horrible seasons. The first year of Nick Saban was 7-6. They barely made a bowl game. None of their players entered the NFL draft that year. And then, what you see now is just ridiculous, right? Just year after year after year. And it's such a good program now that even their top coaching staff after Nick Saban just gets the top jobs across the country, right? Head coaching jobs, right? Kirby Smart. I mean, just look at the alumni that he's kind of built from, ex-employees of Alabama. And it's ridiculous, right? But the only thing that I think is keeping the glue of that program together, despite all the people leaving, is Nick Saban. The moment Nick Saban goes, I think the tides will change. I think there will be some newer entrants who will dominate college football in the next, let's say, decade or so. But it's going to be a while, in my opinion.
Yeah, it's definitely a good point, and we've seen it play out in the past. Paul Bear Bryant was not nearly as dominant as Nick Saban. Now, over time, he accumulated one more championship at this point, but that could be erased here in about 9 days. I think they would be tied 6-6 or 7-7, whatever the number is. But yeah, from the time Bear Bryant retired, and even before he retired, because his last few seasons were good seasons, but not national championship seasons, from the early 80s up until the Saban run in 08, take away the Gene Stallings championship in 1992, and Alabama was turning in typically a lot of 9-3 kind of seasons. I was around for 6 of them, covering Alabama football in the late 90s. Sure, they had a 3-8 season in 2003, I believe. So yeah, it's probably difficult for Alabama fans who are a bit younger to imagine, but just remember that we may be having a different conversation in 10 or 15 years when maybe Alabama's they're what Tennessee is right now. I don't know.
Yeah, and actually Tennessee is a good program. I mean, historically, like you mentioned, 1998, that Peyton Manning, right? They had several good years where they actually won the national title.
Sure.
But I mean, it's where the money goes, it's where the talent goes, and it's where the coaching goes. I think that there's 3 factors kind of determine where a program is kind of headed in the trajectory of the program. When you look at Michigan, right? Michigan, I know you're a big Ohio State guy, so you probably would enjoy the fact that Michigan has just, they haven't been relevant in a long time. And they're historically known as this blue blood program, right? I mean, they had several national titles. I think they have double digits, but that was all very, very ancient when they won, right? 1997 was the last time they won. actual national title, and even that one was shared with another program, I believe. So, it's interesting that you mentioned all these points, but it gets very boring for the viewership to see the same teams every year, and it may continue for quite a few years. Any thoughts on Clemson? Do you think they're going to retain their quarterback? Not their quarterback, sorry, their head coach. And how many years do you think that's going to last?
Is Clemson going to retain their head coach?
Yeah, I mean, they say that Sweeney is going to leave once Saban's gone. So
Okay.
Right? I mean, that because he played for Alabama
Sure.
in undergraduate days.
Yep.
So, people are speculating that he has like big ties to the university and like he really wants to, I guess, continue the legacy, even though he's actually part of like, I guess, destroying the legacy. Not destroying, but like trying to end the dynasty of Alabama as it is. So.
Yeah. So when people ask me questions about whether a guy's going to enter the NFL draft or a coach is going to leave their school and go to another school, I really can only speculate like anybody else. I don't know what drives Dabo Swinney, whether he has the thought process that, hey, I love it here. I enjoy it. My family's here. I don't know the ages of his kids off the top of my head and whether they're entrenched in school. All those factors come into play. And some guys.
Which you know that his kid actually is a wide receiver there too. So.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. And a lot of guys take pride in, okay, I've established something here. I want to be a legend here. I want to be a 25 or 30-year guy here and not be jumping around all over the place. But there could be.
Yeah, and money has a big deal in this too, right?
Sure, of course.
Second highest paid head coach. I'm sure Alabama has the resources, but like, would they want to pay him more than what he's already making? And he doesn't make that much less than Saban, I don't think. So, like, very, very marginal difference between the two coaches that are going to be in the national title game.
Mm-hmm.
And then, there's like these young coaches that could change the trajectory of college football, right? We at Texas, we just got Tom Herman. So, we're hoping that he could turn this program into something more than, just a Big 12 contender. But I think we're on the right trajectory. But then, you also have a young coach at Oklahoma, right? Lincoln Riley. He's going to be around for several decades. He's been in the CFP for 3 years now. And then, your Ohio State Buckeyes, right? They have Ryan Day now. And who knows what he can achieve since he's very young, too. I think he's 39, 40. So, yeah, a lot of interesting developments. And just wanted to kind of see what you think the landscape of the college football scene will be in the coming years. But I don't think that your opinion is too much different from the mainstream. I think that we may unfortunately have to see these two programs continue to dominate the sport for a few more years.
All right, Deeper Rod, I appreciate you calling. I appreciate the comments on the live chat.
Yes, really appreciated it too. Have a lovely New Year's Eve.
Absolutely.
And, I look forward to keeping up with your channel.
Very good. Thank you so much. Talk to you soon.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
All right. Clemson and Alabama dominance. This has been now 4 consecutive years that they've played. Only one time in the actual semifinal. The other 3 times, of course, in the championship game. Alabama is going to be a substantial favorite. I would guess somewhere in the 8 to 10 point range. We've got another call coming in to MarkRogersTV, the voice of college football. Who's on the line?
Hi, this is McD Sports 4.
Hey, how you doing tonight?
Hey, I'm doing good. I'm the one saying that there should be a 16 playoff.
6. Okay, let's hear it. All right, why 6?
Well, obviously, the fun thing about college football is the drama.
Okay.
So, yeah, you still have that debate, like, who should get in, like, that with the bye. Like, I think with the buys with the first and second team, I think that would be a huge drama factor, and you would just create more headlines and more fun with the college football season.
Okay.
I hope.
So that's your motivating factor, to create as much drama as possible.
Well, one other factor I will add is
We're not concerned with being fair or equitable.
Yeah. Just to make it fair, that number 60.
Yeah.
That will have the number 60 will always be a group of 5 team. Whoever's like the best group of 5 team, like UCF or whoever. So
Okay. What?
So it's
Okay. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
the number 16 will be a group of 5 teams. So like every year, that number 60 will be whoever's the best group of 5 team, like UCF, Boise State, etc. Like that would be how I would make it if I was like part of the committee.
Okay, and the other 5 teams would come from where?
It would be just like it is right now, like a committee. Like the committee would still pick the group of 5 team, but it would be like a committee, like how it is now. Like they'll pick 1 through 5, basically.
So you
like
would be okay, since we have 5 major conferences, that, for example, this year the committee may have selected Georgia and a second SEC team, and they also would have selected Notre Dame, and we would have left out the Pac-12 and the Big Ten, even though the Big Ten champion had just as good a record as Oklahoma and had a better record than Georgia. But just because the committee said so, that we go with their 5 teams plus a group of 5 as the 6th team. You're okay with that?
Technically, yes, but I do think Ohio State is better than Georgia, but technically, yes, I'll have to say yes to that.
Okay.
Even though I disagree with it, but I'll have to say yes with what the committee said. One other factor, I think someone brought it up earlier. Tell me if I'm wrong, but I think someone said like last year when Alabama was the 4th seed, it'll be whoever was the number 3 seed playing up before Alabama. So like Georgia versus Alabama. The way I would set it up is 3 versus 6 and 4 versus 5.
Yeah, because you've got to have 2 buys. Sure.
Yeah, but basically, and like also. I think the games will be more interesting. I think, yeah, basically that's what I think.
Why are the games? Why are the games going to be more interesting? You have the same 4 teams involved. Why are the games going to be more interesting? You
have Notre Dame playing UCF, and then you have Oklahoma playing Georgia.
Okay, I think we have to be careful. I think we have to be careful when we select or devise a system that only deals with what's happening right now this particular year. And we put blinders on and just say, well, we had these problems this year, therefore we fixed them by building this system that would have solved some problems this year. You got to build a system that works for every year.
Well, I was looking at previous years as well. Like, for example, in 2015, there was Clemson 1, Alabama 2, Michigan State 3, Oklahoma 4. Obviously, the number 5 team would be Iowa because that was a tight game in the Big Ten championship.
Okay.
There was number 4 and 6.
Why not Ohio State?
Because they were in the championship game.
Okay. Just like, why would Alabama make it last year then? They weren't in the championship game.
I disagree. I didn't think Alabama should have made it last year.
Okay. All right. So you got to go to the championship game, but you can lose the championship game. Is that your rule?
The championship game.
Okay.
Yeah, that's my rule. You could lose.
Okay.
You can't be like Pitt when let's say like Pitt won the championship game.
Okay.
They shouldn't be in. Like, I don't believe conference champions should be in because you look at some.
Then why are we going to have conference championships? Why not? Why shouldn't we should just cancel those then? We'll cancel the conference championships.
I like conference championships.
Why? They're not resulting in anything though. If they're not going to result in anything, then why have them?
The SEC championship resulted in something this year.
Just because somebody gets a trophy? So Pitt if Pitt beat Clemson, we're not going to advance them anywhere, but we're just going to give them a trophy, but we're still going to let Clemson go play in the playoff.
Well, that's what to me, that's just like one scenario on the mindset that the ACC was just weak. I mean, like, the ACC was basically like Clemson and maybe Syracuse and everybody else.
Okay.
So I wouldn't say that for one example, like highlight that for an example. But for instance, last year, Auburn was going to be in the playoffs. They beat Georgia in the SEC championship game. But what happened was that Auburn lost, and Georgia ended up being in the SEC championship game. So to me, championship games, like, not all of them matter like every year. Obviously, like the Pac-12 championship didn't even matter this year because none of those teams are going to make the playoffs. But some of these championships do matter. Like what I brought up in 2015, the Michigan State Iowa Big Ten championship, that mattered as well. So some of them do matter. I'll have to disagree that they don't. They don't matter. I think they do matter to a extent. So I will probably keep them.
All right. We didn't even get to the worst part of the 16 playoff, and that's how are you going to determine which two teams get byes?
1 and 2. Whoever's the 1 and 2 team.
Well, obviously, those are the two teams that get the byes, but how do you determine who's 1 and 2? Who would have been 1 and 2 this year, and why?
Alabama or Clemson would have been 1 and 2
Why?
this year. And I don't even think it was close. Alabama, obviously, best team in the SEC, best conference.
Okay.
It's the SEC.
All right. Why is the SEC the best conference? How did we determine that? How did we determine that?
I looked at games this year, like Auburn. They beat the crap out of Purdue in a bowl game, 63-14, and they also beat the Pac-12 champion in Washington.
Okay, sure. No, I'm not disagreeing with you. Hang on just a second. I'm not disagreeing with you that the SEC is the best conference, but you can't just, you're just kind of arbitrarily saying it. You have no, I'm not hearing what the criteria is. So just because you win the best conference.
I'm looking at middle of the road teams like Auburn being the crap out middle of the road teams in the Big Ten, which to me is the second best conference, the Big Ten.
Oh, okay. Well, you understand that game occurred after the selections would have been made for the playoff. So the committee would not have been able to say Auburn's going to beat the crap out of Purdue.
Correct. But I have another example as well. Auburn in week 1 beating Washington.
Okay.
The Pac-12 champions. Like, to me, that's a middle of the road team in the SEC this year, Auburn, in my opinion. And other examples, for example, basically, like, if you look at the SEC games, they always blow out everybody. Like, look at in this bowl game in the Peach Bowl, Florida versus Michigan. I know Michigan had like half of their starters out, but
bingo.
There's no excuse for Michigan to get beat by 26.
Well, no, there shouldn't be an excuse. You show up and play with whoever you've got, but there's a reason to believe why Michigan lost by 26 points, because they both had similar teams show up twice in the last 24 months, and Michigan killed them the other 2 times. The other thing, you have to determine that Vanderbilt lost a bowl game. Virginia beat South Carolina today by 4 touchdowns. So the SEC is just not annihilating everyone. They're 3-2 right now. So I don't disagree with you that the SEC is the best conference. I believe that the SEC is the best conference, but you haven't answered my question in determining why are there 2 teams selected to get byes? What did they do? What is the criteria year after year after year after year?
Those 2 teams have to either be undefeated or have one, or if there's not 2 undefeated teams like this year, that one loss team better have a very good loss on the record against like a top 10 team.
Okay.
Not like a blowout. So, like, for instance, Ohio State with their one loss. Probably, if comparing them to like Oklahoma, I'll probably give the edge to Oklahoma if it came down to that.
Okay, so last year Clemson was the #1 seed. They lost to a 4-8 Syracuse team. So there's no way they get a bye. They shouldn't have gotten a bye. We kick them back.
Well, if there's another one-loss team, and we just compare the losses, whoever has the better loss, you give them the bye. So
Well, you just told me that you needed to lose to a top 10 team. So Clemson lost to a 4-win team, so they don't get a bye last year. And
yeah, probably not.
And Oklahoma lost to Iowa State. They were a 5-loss team, so they don't get a bye. So we got to kick them back. Alabama didn't even win their division, so they're not going to get a bye. So who gets the byes last year? I'm not coming up with any teams that should get byes based on your criteria.
Last year, I would probably given the byes. Personally, last year, just looking at it, it would have probably been Clemson, Oklahoma, Georgia, Alabama, and Ohio State as your top 5. Last year, obviously the criteria has to be a bit flexible in the mindset that not like every Clemson, Oklahoma, Georgia, and Alabama all had one loss.
Okay.
Alabama would have gotten the bye, in my opinion. Yeah, Alabama would have gotten the bye. They lost to Auburn, which was a top 10 team. I believe Auburn was making up
all right, sir. I appreciate your playoff model there, but I think you need to do some work on it.
Okay.
Your criteria is a bit sketchy because you're contradicting your criteria. You laid out the criteria, and then I told you how the criteria doesn't work. What's that?
I'm coming up with it on the top of my head. But I think a 16 playoff will work.
No, we don't want to give teams byes. That doesn't work. That's not fair. It just doesn't make any sense.
I think it does personally.
Yeah, there would be no reason. So, for example, in this so we're basically telling 4 teams you have to play an extra game just because we arbitrarily like these other 2 teams better. And that's what it is. It's arbitrary. It's not based on anything factual that they earned. We just covered 2 years, and there was nothing that those teams did that was earning them a spot over the other teams.
Yeah, 2017, I'll have to say that'll be tough to figure out. I'll probably, just looking at the byes, it'll probably be Georgia and Alabama getting the byes.
You're going to give byes to these 2 teams in the same conference, and one of them didn't win their own division. And you just said that you had to. You told me at the beginning of the conversation that you had to go to your conference championship game. You told me you had to go to your conference championship game to make the playoff, and now you're telling me that Alabama's going to make a playoff last year. But you told me at the beginning of the conversation that they wouldn't make the playoff.
Correct. Yeah, I kind of contradict myself there.
Well, I appreciate. Thanks for the phone call. It's tough. Yeah, work out your system and give me a call back.
Okay, I will.
All right. You have a good night. Enjoy the championship game. Right. Okay. Boy, I'm patient. All right. If you're going to propose a playoff system, work out your criteria and have it make some semblance of sense. It doesn't have to be completely foolproof tested. All right, folks, let me check out the rest of the chat. We'll see where we stand here. The basis of a 16 playoff has to be that 1-6, 1-8. Wait a minute. You got 6 teams, and then 1-8 shouldn't be in the same position. Whoo! 8 with top 4 getting home field is something I'd support. MCD Sports, I was just having a little fun with you. I appreciate your phone call. And you're not alone in people that want a 6-team playoff. I just personally don't understand it, and I can't get behind it because there is no rationale that you can apply year to year to distinguish why two teams get a bye over other teams. In other sports and other formats, it makes sense if you have teams that have clearly established themselves as winning, let's say, a division, and other teams who are second and third place teams. Therefore, you reward that team that won a division over teams that are just wild cards. So that makes sense. I don't totally agree with it, but at least it makes sense. You are rewarding a team in Major League Baseball, for example, for winning the division, and the wild card have to play an extra round or an extra game. But just to arbitrarily say, we like these two teams better, and because their losses weren't that bad. Oh, well, actually they were, because Clemson lost to Syracuse and they only went 4-8, and Oklahoma lost to Iowa State and they went 8-5. Well, I guess we changed our criteria. Oh, we said Alabama can't make it because they didn't win the division. Oh, we just put them in. All right. So anyway, thank you so much for watching Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football. If you had a comment or a question and you put it in the chat, I obviously missed it. So I review the comments at some point every day. So I just pull up the comments link on my channel and it just shows all the comments. And I can't get back to all the comments. I had like 9,000 last month, but I try to scan them and get to any comments that I see from maybe somebody that I've never seen comment before. And I say hi and welcome to Mark Rogers TV, and I answer their question or respond to their comment. Or certainly when somebody blasts me and call me an idiot, I enjoy responding to that. I had some of those today. Somebody was calling me an idiot for something. I got to find this comment. It's beautiful. I got to find this comment. It's going to be near the top of the chain. Hang on just a second. So, yes, I love when the game's over and people comment what the score was. Yeah, we know that Clemson won 30-3. All right. Okay, I've gotten a lot of comments since then. Where is it? Where is it? Da, da, da. Da, da, da. Da, 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 da. Shoot, it's buried now. I thought there was a funny comment in here from somebody. Shoot, can't find it. All right, sorry, can't find it. Just look at the comments that I received. They're funny. They are funny sometimes when people tell me they try to illegitimize what I think or what my... I love when people try to tell me what kind of job I have, and they tell me I need to go back to mopping floors or flipping burgers or whatever I do the rest of the my work time. I find that amusing. All right, let's get back to the live chat, and I want to see if there's anything else on there that I need to respond to. And again, if you left anything for me in the comment section, which I don't think that you did in the live chat section, but if you did, I'm not going to be able to find it. So just come back and leave it for me in one of the comments. I do see that Tom PSU, which I believe probably stands for Penn State. Mark, any chance playoff games could be played on campuses instead of neutral locations? Don't think bowls would allow it, but would love to see it happen. Well, one of the reasons why the larger this expands, that the more talk is given to on-campus games would be that if your team would have to win 3 games, let's say, to win a national championship, or would have to win 2 games to get to the national championship game, well, you don't want people circling across the country if they want to be able to see their team play. So if Alabama's going to play 1 week in the Citrus Bowl in the first round, and then they're going to play in the Cotton Bowl in the second round, and then they're going to play the championship game at the Rose Bowl, well, you don't want to make it difficult on people that would have no incentive to go see Alabama play in the Citrus Bowl in the first round, because they'd be like, well, we know Alabama's going to beat Central Florida, so we're not going to go see them play their first game in the Citrus Bowl, so the place is going to be empty. And so we'll wait until the national semifinal game, or we'll just wait until they play in the national championship game. So you bring the games on campus. I think if you go past anything past what we currently have, if there's an extra game involved, a third potential game for any one team or two teams, then you would have to play one of those games on campus. Again, just because you're asking the fan base to travel all over the place. And 2 stops is enough, but then you're asking for a third trip. Wade, OSU fans, it's easy to say you're better when you know you don't have to prove it. So that's a double-edged sword, Wade. You're totally right. Ohio State fans, just like Central Florida fans, just like Georgia fans, can say, "Hey, if we were in the playoff, this would have happened." Sure, they can. But on the flip side, Ohio State could beat Washington 52-0, and they will still have people saying, "Big deal. Washington sucks. Washington doesn't belong. Washington lost 3 games." So that goes both ways. We'll take it for what it is. Last year, Ohio State was matched up against USC. USC was ranked, I think, 8th in the country. Ohio State beat them 24-7. Some people came away from that game saying Ohio State just dominated one of the best offenses in the country with a #1 rated quarterback who went top 3 in the NFL draft, with one of the best running backs in the country, with some of the best wide receiver position players in the country, with Deontay Burnett, etc. And they shut them down to 7 points. And really, USC shouldn't have scored those 7 points. They got a short field of 15 yards because of a punt that was fumbled. And so some people came away impressed with the Ohio State victory to say they just beat #8 team in the country by 17 points, and it really wasn't even that close. Other people said USC sucks, the Pac-12 sucks, Ohio State didn't prove anything. And the same thing's going to happen after the Rose Bowl if Ohio State wins. If Ohio State loses, your most ardent Ohio State defenders are going to say, well, we didn't care to be there. We didn't play hard. We didn't want to be there. We weren't motivated. But reasonable people will either say, well, there you go. Ohio State's really not that good. Or reasonable people like myself might say, Ohio State didn't show up. They didn't play well. Washington deserved to win. They were the better team on that day. I still probably think Ohio State's better. I would really have to be proven that Washington's better than Ohio State. And Ohio State, hey, they have the talent on the roster to play with some of the teams that we've seen play tonight. But did they look capable of competing with those teams most of the season? No, they did not. Not against Nebraska, not against Maryland, not against Purdue, certainly. But they did against Michigan. They did against Northwestern. They played a better game against Northwestern than Notre Dame did. They obliterated Michigan. We know from looking at the recruiting rankings and looking at the NFL production from these rosters that Ohio State belongs from a talent perspective, but they didn't look the part most of the season, but near the end they did. And when it came right down to it, most people believe that the Big Ten's the second best conference, and Ohio State won the Big Ten with only 1 loss and won the championship game by 21 points. So you've got your pros and cons when it comes to Ohio State, but I understand what you're saying there, Wade. Who remembers Woody Hayes? I do. Not a lot about him, but I do a bit. Buckeyes can't lose and think they belong in the college football playoff. Okay. Cheryl, I really enjoy your comments, and I appreciate you joining us here in the last few weeks. But let's understand that 14 of the 20 teams that have made the college football playoff over these 5 years, 4 spots per year, 20 teams, 14 of the 20 have lost games. So if we're going to say that about one team, then why don't we say that about everybody? Ohio State, Alabama, and Oregon should not have made it in 2014. Michigan State, Oklahoma, Alabama should not have made it in 2015. Ohio State, Clemson, and Washington should not have made it in 2016. Last year, Alabama should not have made it. Clemson shouldn't have been there. Georgia and Oklahoma, nobody should have been there. I don't know what we would have done last year. Nobody made the playoff. And then this year, of course, our number 4 team, Oklahoma, should not have been in the playoff. That if you lose a game that's what I'm reading, right? That if you lose a game, you should not be in the playoff. Buckeyes can't lose and think they belong in the playoff. So I'm not understanding that. Mark, would you ever favor a draft system of high school talent for college football? Well, absolutely not. I would not favor that because we live in a free country. These kids should be able to go to school wherever they want. There's a difference with the NFL. People misconstrue who's ultimately paying these players in a professional sport. Without the league and the different components of the league or the different entities and organizations, you don't have a league. You don't have the NFL. So if all the players wanted to go play for the New England Patriots, well, then you would cease to have an NFL because they'd all be playing for one team. Therefore, the NFL is one organization. Therefore, when you are drafted into the NFL, then I don't find it to be an issue like many players do who feel as though they're being manipulated or constricted by sending them and being drafted by a particular team. No, you are playing for the NFL, and for the NFL to function, there have to be teams. So if you're drafted by Cleveland or Cincinnati or San Diego, too bad, you've got to go play for that particular team. It's like me. I have been employed at ESPN for 17 years. They must like what I do. I enjoy being paid and going to work there, but I don't get to choose, oh, they've got an office in LA, I'm going to go there. Oh, they have offices in Orlando and New York City and Austin, Texas, I want to go there, and Charlotte. No, I work where they tell me to work. Just like a player who's drafted into the NFL goes and has to play where they are told that they have to play, where they are selected. Otherwise, the league breaks down. They have to distribute the talent and the commodities evenly among all their competitors, because otherwise they don't have a league. But that doesn't exist in college football because the important component, let's not forget, is the actual student portion of the student athlete role. And therefore, the student should be able to choose wherever they want to go to school, as long as that school says, we want you to play football and we're going to pay for you to play football, or we think that you're at least worthy to come out and try out for a walk-on position on our football team. But to have a draft among the colleges, again, sometimes when we start these arguments, I like to state at the beginning of the conversation, okay, this is a realistic conversation. This could happen in reality versus this is fantasy, and we can continue the conversation, but this is all it is fantasy. Like if we want to say who would win a game between the 2001 Miami Hurricanes and the 2018 Alabama Crimson Tide. Well, that's fantasy, and we can talk about it until we're blue in the face. We could sit here for weeks and dissect the lineups, but it's all fantasy and it's never going to be proven. And that's what this is, talking about a draft for colleges of high school talent. That's a fantasy. It's not going to happen. We live in a free country, and individuals can make a decision on where they want to attend school. All right. 2 years in a row, the Buckeyes lost in their conference. So again, Cheryl, I'm not understanding. Oklahoma lost in their conference. Okay. Alabama lost in their conference last year. Last year, Oklahoma lost in their conference. So for the last 2 years, Oklahoma's lost in its conference. Clemson lost in their conference last year. These teams are constantly losing in their conference that go to the college football playoff. So I'm guessing what you want, Cheryl, is that in 2014, Florida State was the only undefeated team in the country. So we shouldn't have had a playoff. We just canceled the playoff and give the trophy to Florida State. And then in 2015, Clemson was the only team in the country with 0 losses. So we canceled the playoff and we give Clemson the trophy. In 2016, Alabama was the only team. Do you see a trend? These teams that went undefeated, they didn't actually go on to win the championship. Alabama was the only undefeated team in the regular season in 2016, so we should have just given them the championship. In 2017, I don't know what we going to do, because nobody went undefeated except Central Florida. They get the championship trophy in 2017. This year, I guess we kick out Oklahoma and we let Central Florida play in their place, and then we play the playoff. So, I'm not Mark committee bias truth. Mark, tell me committee isn't biased. I can't tell you that. I have no idea. I hope they don't try to be biased. I hope that they're attempting not to be. It's just like when I come on here and give my opinion, I've got my bias over here. We all have bias. We wouldn't be humans if we weren't biased to some degree. But I try to check that, just like in 2016, when I said on this very channel, I went on a rant. I went on a campaign for Penn State to be selected to the playoff ahead of Ohio State. Even though I wanted Ohio State to be selected, I was trying to be neutral and unbiased and stick to my formula that Penn State won the conference, won the head-to-head, therefore they should be selected to go to the playoff. But we're all biased. My issue would be if the committee was outwardly and overtly biased. If the people in that room were thinking, you know what, I don't care about these metrics. I don't care who deserves it, who earned it. I'm just selecting whatever I think, or worse than that, I'm a big SEC guy, or I'm a big ACC guy, or because my school, even though I can't argue for them in the room, I'm going to influence these other teams and persuade these other arguments in a way that's going to benefit my school. I hope that doesn't go on, but I wouldn't be surprised if it does. Mark, are you prepared for the Jeremy Pruitt dynasty? Well, I'll get right on that, Hound Dog. I've got about 8 months to prepare myself for next August 31st, because, of course, that's the first Saturday of college football in 2019. So I've got about 8 months that I can prepare myself for the Jeremy Pruitt dynasty. Please send me a list of items that I need to execute to best prepare myself for the Jeremy Pruitt dynasty, because I would love to do that. I don't know how to prepare myself for it, but I sure want to know what I need to do. I'm starting to get a bit giddy and delirious at 2:34 a.m. Thoughts on Loxley to Maryland? Good hire. Based on what he's able to do on the football field for Alabama, working with that personnel, it seems to be a good hire. He certainly did not have a good run with New Mexico State. I get New Mexico and New Mexico State mixed up, so I apologize if I mix them up. But he had a rough, not just on the field, but and I can't remember the particular circumstances, but I read about them when he just got the job at Maryland a few weeks ago. He had some questionable decisions that he made when he was at New Mexico, and questionable handling of situations. So hopefully he has learned from that, and certainly has had the opportunity to learn from the best. So it appears to be a good hire. Yes, 3-31 as a head coach. What qualifies as elite? Boy, we have that conversation all the time. Athletic dash hole. I am going to go through, because I want to certainly, me and Mark need to talk. Cheryl, I'm here. You can talk to me anytime. 860-325-3687. I would like to go through here and just say hi to anybody who's on here who I've never seen show up on Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football. So that would be Archie Rock. Welcome to the channel. We are the voice of college football. I hope you enjoy the videos, the live streams, the analysis, the debate, the discussion, everything that we do concerning college football here. Tom PSU, I've acknowledged some of your comments. This is the first time I've seen you here on our live chat, which most of the regulars, the old timers here, have unashamedly called the best live chat room in college football. And Archie, I thank you for subscribing. Bama Boy likes the Christmas tree. So here's a quick note on the Christmas tree. My daughter and I, we take great pride in selecting beautiful Christmas trees. This would be the worst tree we've ever selected, and there's a reason why. We take great pride. Usually we have a perfectly symmetrical tree that we find, a real tree that's nice and fat and plump, but not too fat, and nice and tall, you know, a good 7 feet tall, probably 7.5 feet tall. But what's happened is my daughter's in college. So for the past 2 years, instead of going out the week after Thanksgiving, it's usually like conference championship weekend, that first or second day of December. We go out that weekend with my son. I got to drag him along because he really doesn't care. It's more of my daughter and I who care. And we go out and we do some Christmas shopping, Christmas baking, and decorating. And of course, we go get the tree. Well, my daughter's been in college for the past 2 years. So the past 2 years, we actually had to default to a artificial tree last year. It pained us. But for this particular year, I went to Lowe's with my daughter, and this was just the Saturday because she just finished up finals the Wednesday prior to Christmas, that we went out the Friday or Saturday before Christmas. So it was like the 22nd or 3rd. And there were only like 5 trees left at Lowe's. And we were able to find, like, the rest of them just were complete, just atrocities, awful, ugly looking things, just sparse and ready to be beaten down and just obliterated, just nothing to them. And that we came up with. And of course, we're hiding the bad spot. But that was the best that we came up with. So I appreciate the acknowledgement on the Christmas tree. We like to junk up my tree with way too many ornaments. Family is important. Absolutely, Cheryl. Love your content. Super underrated. Ever try to get on a solid verbal or PAPN? I have not. Archie has been watching me for about an hour. So far, so good. So, Archie, knock yourself out. I've got 8,000 videos here. So I won't even try to describe and try to explain what's available here. I bring on what I consider to be the best bloggers, broadcasters, writers that I can find across the nation to represent their particular teams and conferences. We have great discussion, debate, analysis. I rank everything in sight. I rank quarterbacks. I rank running backs. I rank offensive linemen. I rank schedules. I rank teams. I rank historic teams. I do all sorts of things like that. And I take phone calls. And this is, of course, Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football, which I will remind everyone that you gave me that name, and I appreciate it, the voice of college football. Who's on the line?
It's Atheist for the Cause again.
Whoa, who is this?
Atheist for the Cause.
All right. So you were able to work on your playoff system.
Well, I wanted to, talk about the draft. No, you talked to a different guy.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. So this
I
is.
I called earlier for the other game, but anyways, about the draft system that I was talking about, like, I think a draft system could actually happen, although I don't think it ever would. But if you limit the scholarship money, then that would make sense, because nobody has. It's a privilege to get a scholarship. Nobody has a right to a scholarship. So you could make it where colleges can offer their scholarship, in a draft order, and then you can't give like 2 scholarships to the same player or have some sort of rule like that. And then that player can either choose to get the scholarship from the team that drafts them, or, pay their own way at a different school that they want to go to. I mean, it's a lot like walk-ons right now. And
So I don't think that's completely out of the realm of possibility.
Okay, I'm still not getting the point where we live in a free society and we're forcing student athletes to go to particular schools. What am I missing?
Well, we wouldn't be forcing them to go to a school. It's just that if it would be getting a financial benefit for going to certain schools, like in terms of a scholarship, that your average person doesn't have access to anyways. So this is a privileged, thing, scholarship. So I feel like the way you're talking about it is like they have a right to that scholarship, but they don't.
No, it's not their right. They're not entitled to the scholarship. It's been offered to them because of their abilities.
Right. So then I think the NCAA it's within the NCAA's rights to try to create a more even system than what we have now. And I actually think it would help student athletes, because right now you have all of these kids who go to just a few schools, Alabama and Clemson's of the world, and they have geographic advantages as well. And then all the top talent goes to a few schools. They don't get to become starters, and then they don't get they could be a starter at a different school and prove themselves, and then if they ever want to transfer, they can't, and that kind of defeats your argument as well about letting kids go where they want. Like right now, there are really harsh punishments for someone who goes to a school and then wants to transfer. I mean, having to sit out a year is a lot worse, I'd say, than having to pay your way if you want to choose to go to a team that didn't draft you.
Okay, that might be your argument, but in reality, it's obviously not. It's not deterring these kids from doing it, because we're seeing more and more every year transfer. It's happening all over the place. So let's go back to a real life situation. Let's work your, because I'm not trying to be condescending. Sure.
Because one thing about what you said is, didn't they open up transfer rules a little bit?
Absolutely.
A couple of years ago.
Yes.
So it does happen more now than it used to, but there are still pretty harsh rules. But if they're not going into their senior year or whatever it is.
Well, they don't seem to be too harsh. We had two teams, two guys playing for. Who were they playing for? They were just playing for I was just watching them last night. I can't remember what game it was, but we had two offensive playmakers for a particular team that were playing. It was for Syracuse. They had a kid transfer from Michigan State. They had another kid from Oklahoma, and neither one of them, not just sitting out a year, they were able to play in the bowl game because it was the second semester of the school year. Therefore, they were given still the 2 years of eligibility, plus they were able to play in the bowl game this year.
Yeah, I saw that wide receiver for Michigan State got that big touchdown catch, too. So he actually did have a huge impact. And I'm a Wisconsin fan. A couple of years ago, we had Russell Wilson.
Absolutely.
That changed our team. So
and actually, the running back from Oklahoma scored the other two touchdowns for Syracuse. So I just want you to take me through your system in a practical setting, in a real life circumstance. So I'm a college football player, or I'm a high school football player, of course, and I'm in the state of North Carolina. And I'm not choosing North Carolina because I'm trying to box you in. I just picked a state. I live in North Carolina. I'm a high school football player, and I would like to play at North Carolina State. That's where I would like to play, but I've got to go into this draft. So what's going to happen then?
Well, there's two ways it could be done. The first way is that, you could just have it be the system where they, say Wisconsin, my team, drafts him. He either has to come to Wisconsin to get a scholarship, or he's got to pay his way through their own. They'd probably still be open to academic scholarships if they wanted that. So then the other route would be to allow a person or a team to, or a player to stick within their state and still get a scholarship. So you could make an exception for a player that's going to school within their own state, and
Okay.
that would offer some sort of inequality, because like California schools would have an advantage over other states, but there's no perfect system. So,
And you're making that claim because California has more schools.
I know, because California is first of all, it's a huge state, and it's a really good high school talent pool, and so there's a lot of prospects to choose from. So it's actually, if there were fewer schools, then those schools would benefit even more. But yeah, in terms of like high school talent, there's a lot more in California than most states. So like I'm in, say the University of Wisconsin, there's not too much talent to choose from in Wisconsin.
So we're doing all this to even the playing field of competitive balance.
Right, that would be one downfall, like that exception, but it could be made because as a sort of compromise. But I think that you would still end up with that compromise. You would still end up with a more competitive system than what we have now.
So you called it a draft. So let's say I'm the best football player in America, and this is the consensus from, first of all, who determines I'm the best football player in America? I guess 247 Sports or some kind of conglomeration of rating services. But maybe,
Yes, go Finger.
but so we have a draft, and Oregon State was the worst team in Power 5 football or in FBS football last year, let's say, and Oregon State gets the first pick.
Mm-hmm.
So they're going to select me,
I would say,
and I live in.
Just do Power 5 schools.
Okay, Power 5 schools. Oregon State was the worst team, let's say, so they get the #1 pick. I live in North Carolina, and I'm going to have to go to Oregon State.
Correct.
Okay.
You could also another thing too, if you didn't want to do the exception to the home state rule that I came up with.
Yeah.
You could also force the school to pave the way for the player to move. So that would make an exception, or that would help out a lot of the financial costs for a player, moving to Oregon State, and living in their dorms. You could just pay all their way. So.
Okay. I just don't see it like a profession. The profession being the NFL, where it's understood that these players are playing into a league in which there has to be distribution of talent for it to function competitively. And the NFL is one complete organization versus these are all separate schools that have less connection to each other, and they all have thousands of players to review and recruit. Again, I just don't like the forced action of sending a student athletes to a particular school because that school needs better players.
I get that, and but another point I want to make too, that it's not really about the draft system, but a failure of the current system is that it really schools with bad academics get benefited. So like schools like Stanford or probably even UCLA, I think is up there.
Sure.
Those top academic schools have a tough time being recruited, and then like if you're a top talent, you have to choose. Do you want to go to a school with bad academics that even if you could, even if you're really smart and really gifted athletically and you could succeed at a high education school, you still might have to go to a school with bad academics to get, say like Alabama or something, where they're not the greatest academically, but they have the best football program. So you really have to choose your path right from the start like that, then it's, most kids don't make it. Even if they're highly recruited, they usually don't make it in the NFL. So, and then these schools are like creating fake programs that are like sports management and stuff. It's not a real program.
Yeah, so that's been talked about in recent years in terms of having a legitimate course of study and degree versus being real and being truthful and saying, okay, this kid is ultra talented at football, and the purpose of college is to prepare a person for a profession. Well, we are preparing them to play professional football. And while they're here, they still have to learn and be educated in a more round, what word am I looking for? In a more well-rounded way, just like we would if they chose accounting. We still mandate that they study other courses and go through other courses of study. And so we would do that even if you chose football, but it would not be confused that you're the best quarterback in the country coming out of high school. You have selected football as your major, and that's your main focus, and that's your major.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying that's the way we should do it, but I'm just saying that's sometimes talked about.
Yeah. A way, if you wanted to try to offer them multiple paths, a way to kind of fix this maybe would be try to create some sort of financial incentive for schools who are better academically and they are going to have tougher time recruiting, give them more scholarship money to play with or something like that. I don't, this is just something I'm coming off the cuff with, so I don't have a system thought out, but that would be a potential solution.
Okay.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, definitely.
But then one other quick point, and then I'll let you go, is
okay.
What you were saying about the playoff system before. Like, I totally agreed. 6 teams doesn't make sense because my argument for that is you have so many teams in the SBS. Why cut out 2 to make it 6 and still add the extra week from 4 teams? Like, I get the argument for 4 teams because then you cut out a week of wear and tear on a player's body. But if you are going to add the extra week, then add as many teams as possible. And, because there are enough teams to put in put into the playoffs with 8 teams. So, but I think when you start getting crazy, like 64 teams, the teams,
sure.
The teams at the bottom, you're adding way too many weeks, and teams at the bottom have no chance to win it anyway. So.
Yeah, I have a couple guests that come on, one in particular on a regular basis who I respect a great deal, but he thinks it's just completely watered down to go to 8 teams. And my main point among many is that in professional football, we have 12 out of 32 make it. In professional baseball, we have 10 out of 30. In the NBA, we have 16 out of 32. So we have anywhere from like 35 to 50% of the teams make it. If we go to 8 teams, that is still only 8 out of 130. It's about 6.5% of the teams would make the playoff field. This is still an elite status. It's still a cream of the crop proposition that we would be elevating into a playoff. And so I don't think it's watered down by any stretch.
No, and when you say it like that, like 6.5%, to me that sounds like a great number. You know what I mean?
Sure.
So, anyways, I know it's getting late for
you. All
you,
right, sir.
So I'll let you go.
Appreciate it.
Have a good one.
You too. We'll talk to you later. All right, and I think I saw a couple comments I'll address very quickly. Somebody had asked about, I think it was our Penn State friend, had asked about Jake Fromm. Jake Fromm's a really good quarterback. I would rank him. Let's see, this is an exercise I go through each off season, is ranking the quarterbacks going into the next season. I don't believe I did that this past off season. I don't remember, but I've done that for a number of years. Jake Fromm is not as good as Tunga Vailoa. He's not as good as Dwayne Haskins. He's not as good as Kyler Murray. After those 3, I'm just thinking Power 5, not that there aren't, especially at quarterback, a number of group of 5 guys that are in that mix of top 10 to 20 players at that position. The kid at Washington State's good. Gardner Minshew. Nobody else in the Pac-12. Nobody else in the Big 12. Ellinger improved a ton this year, but I still wouldn't put him at the very top. I'd put him in somewhere in the 10 to 15 range. Anybody else in the SEC? Drew Lock. Trace McSorley when he's healthy. Nobody else in the ACC. Certainly not in Miami. Anywhere else in the ACC? No. Ryan Finley, very good quarterback, but Jake Fromm, I think, is better than him, at least at the college level. I don't know how they project to the next level. So I say Jake Fromm is one of the 10 best quarterbacks in the nation. I think I would rate him somewhere between 5 and 10. And do I have an issue with mid-round draft selections sitting out bowl games? Okay, the football fan in me has an issue with everybody sitting out bowl games. The competitor in me and what I would like to see out of these athletes who should be committed to these schools that have given them a scholarship would be that as long as they're healthy, that they should be fulfilling their scholarship requirements, that basically the agreement between the student athlete and the school was that for as long as you are eligible and healthy, that you are playing a sport for us that you have signed up to play. Therefore, we delivered to you in exchange for that meal money, room and board, and an education. So therefore, you are not fulfilling your scholarship. So that's an issue I have with whomever, regardless of how high a draft pick that they would be. On the flip side, I don't care if you're projected to be the number 1 player in the draft or you're projected to be the 200th player selected in the NFL draft. That really, if you think about it, shouldn't matter. They're both preparing their future. They're both preparing to sign a substantial contract. One of them is going to sign a $25 million contract. One of them is going to sign a 1-year, $700,000 contract. But that's still substantial money, enough to pay the bills, enough to look out for your future. And if you plan correctly, to extend your savings, investments into the future. Therefore, I would not make a distinction myself between somebody who's projected to be a first-round pick and somebody who's projected to be a 4th or 5th round pick. They're both have just as valid concerns about their health, prohibiting them from signing an NFL contract. So I don't think that distinction should be made. But I do think it's serious business when you talk about players who are sitting out, who have agreed to exchange their athletic ability to play out a schedule as long as they're healthy in exchange for room and board, meal money, and a scholarship and an education. And they're not fulfilling that. All right. Thanks so much for joining us at Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football. For those of you like Archie who have just subscribed recently, check out the videos. We have covered as much as we possibly can. I had meant to review my notes on Michigan, Florida, and South Carolina, Virginia, and the 2 semifinal games, but I probably won't at this point, considering it's 2:59 in the morning. I am going to bed, and this is pretty early for me to go to bed, actually, but I'm going to go to bed very soon, and maybe I'll get to some of that stuff tomorrow, but I appreciate it. Thanks so much for the time and the support. Like, comment, subscribe. That keeps the channel going. Also, sign up for our newsletter, The Voice of College Football, which comes out each and every Monday. The Voice of College Football. Just send your email address to mine at MarkRogersTV@gmail. MarkRogersTV@gmail. Just send me your email, and I will get you out the newsletter each and every week. I will not do anything stupid or unethical with your email address. Keep in mind that you will have my email address as well. And also keep in mind that I will not clutter up your inbox. Ask anybody on the live chat who subscribes. I will not clutter up your inbox. That will be 1 mailing per week that will include a channel update, my take on the college football week or weekend, and then also a section that's become very popular of stats, trends, and facts on college football. Right here at the voice of college football, Mark Rogers TV. We will see you soon. I will be back certainly by New Year's Day, New Year's Eve, actually, taking in all those bowl games. I think it's a very underrated day with 6 games from a lot of second and third tier teams like Texas A&M and North Carolina State, Stanford, Pitt, Utah, Northwestern, and others. So I enjoy that day. And then we'll, of course, get you set for New Year's Day. We already have previews posted on Georgia, Texas, Ohio State, Washington, LSU, Central Florida, and Kentucky and Penn State. Right here at Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football. We'll see you soon. And Bama Boy, thank you so much for reminding everyone to smash that like button. YouTube loves that, and that helps me. Thank you. You guys are funny. We'll see you soon.